Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I've never been one for dramatics, but the events that unfolded during that fateful summer of 2019 still haunt my dreams and waking hours alike. My name is Amos Tillman, and I was 28 years old when it all went down. I'm just an average guy from a small town in West Virginia, where life usually moves at a predictable pace. Nothing in my mundane existence could have prepared me for the horror that awaited in the depths of the Appalachian wilderness. It all started innocently enough, a simple idea for a camping trip. My buddies and I had been talking about it for months, dreaming of escaping the monotony of our daily lives and reconnecting with nature. There were 4 of us: myself, Randy Holbrook, Chester Garner, and Lyle Dawson. We'd known each other since high school, and despite the different paths our lives had taken, we'd managed to stay close. Randy was the outdoorsy one, always planning hikes and fishing trips. He worked as a park ranger and knew the Appalachian trails like the back of his hand. Chester was the joker of the group, always ready with a quip or a prank. He worked in IT, and this trip was his idea of unplugging from the digital world. Lyle was the quietest of us, a high school teacher with a passion for photography. He was eager to capture the beauty of the mountains on film. As for me, I was somewhere in the middle. I enjoyed the outdoors but wasn't as gung-ho about it as Randy. I worked as a mechanic at the local garage, and the idea of getting away from the constant smell of motor oil and the sound of power tools was incredibly appealing. We spent weeks planning the trip, poring over maps and trail guides. Randy knew of a secluded spot deep in the mountains, far from the usual camping grounds. "It's pristine," he'd said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Hardly anyone goes there. We'll have the whole place to ourselves." Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. The isolation that seemed so appealing then would soon become our worst nightmare. We gathered supplies: tents, sleeping bags, food, first aid kits. Chester insisted on bringing his state-of-the-art GPS device, despite Randy's assurances that he knew the way. Lyle packed his camera gear carefully, anticipating the breathtaking vistas he'd capture. I focused on making sure Randy's old van was in good shape for the journey. The rusty behemoth had seen better days, but with a bit of tinkering, I was confident it would get us there and back. The night before we left, I had trouble sleeping. There was an inexplicable sense of unease gnawing at the pit of my stomach. I chalked it up to excitement and perhaps a touch of anxiety about leaving my comfort zone. If only I'd known then what that feeling really meant. If only I'd listened to that primal instinct warning me of the dangers that lay ahead. But I didn't. Instead, I pushed the feeling aside and focused on the adventure to come. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I had no idea that in just a few days, my world would be turned upside down. That I would witness things that would shatter my understanding of reality, that one of us wouldn't be coming back. The last thought that crossed my mind before sleep took me was a simple one. This is going to be a trip to remember. I had no idea how tragically prophetic those words would prove to be. The morning of our departure dawned clear and bright, a perfect day for the start of our adventure. I woke early, double-checking my backpack and running through mental checklists. By 5:30 a.m., I was loading my gear into Randy's van, the old vehicle groaning under the weight of our equipment. One by one, the others arrived. Chester stumbled up, bleary-eyed and clutching a thermos of coffee like a lifeline. Lyle was more alert, carefully stowing his camera bag in a safe spot. Randy was the last to arrive, but his excitement was palpable. He tossed his backpack in and clapped his hands together. "All right, boys," he grinned. "Who's ready for an adventure?" We piled into the van, Randy taking the wheel. As we pulled away from my driveway, I felt a mix of excitement and that lingering unease from the night before. The familiar streets of our small town gave way to country roads, and soon we were heading into the rolling hills that marked the beginning of Appalachian territory. The drive was filled with the kind of easy banter that comes from years of friendship. Chester regaled us with stories from his IT job, mimicking his clueless bosses to perfection. Lyle talked about his students, sharing anecdotes that had us all in stitches. Randy chimed in with tales of encounters with wildlife and clueless tourists from his ranger job. I mostly listened, content to soak in the camaraderie. But as the hours wore on and the landscape grew wilder, that nagging feeling of disquiet returned. The dense forests pressing in on both sides of the road seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Around noon, we stopped at a small diner in the last town before we'd head deep into the mountains. It was a quaint place, all checked tablecloths and the smell of fresh pie. The waitress, a friendly older woman named Dottie, chatted with us as she took our orders. "You boys heading up into the mountains?" she asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Randy nodded, swallowing a mouthful of coffee. "Yep, going to do some camping." Dottie's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, whereabouts?" When Randy mentioned the area we were heading to, Dottie's face went pale. She recovered quickly, but I caught the flash of fear in her eyes. "You be careful up there," she said, her voice low. "Those woods, they ain't always friendly." We laughed it off, chalking it up to local superstition. But as we got back on the road, Dottie's warning echoed in my mind. The further we drove, the more oppressive the forest seemed. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. The conversation in the van had died down, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio as it lost signal. We were truly entering the wilderness now. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken, not with the onset of evening, but with gathering storm clouds. The air grew heavy and electric, the promise of rain hanging over us. Randy assured us we'd reach our campsite before the storm hit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that nature itself was trying to warn us away. We turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt track. The van jolted and bounced, the suspension groaning in protest. Branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle, leaving trails in the dust on the windows. It felt like we were driving into the maw of some great beast, being swallowed up by the wilderness. As the first drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the windshield, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees. It was just for a moment, a flash of movement that was gone as quickly as it appeared. But in that split second, I could have sworn I saw a face, pale, expressionless, watching us pass. I blinked and it was gone. When I asked if anyone else had seen it, they just looked at me strangely. Chester made a joke about me seeing Bigfoot and the moment passed. But the image of that face stayed with me, hovering at the edges of my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. Little did I know that fleeting glimpse was just the beginning. As we pushed deeper into the heart of the mountains, we were crossing a threshold. We were entering a realm where the rules of our mundane world no longer applied, where ancient nameless things lurked in the shadows. The rain began to fall in earnest as Randy finally brought the van to a stop in a small clearing. "We're here," he announced, a note of relief in his voice. As we peered through the rain-streaked windows at our home for the next few days, a bolt of lightning illuminated the forest around us. In that brief, stark moment of brightness, the trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching down like claws. We had arrived at our destination, but our true journey, one that would take us to the very limits of sanity and survival, was only just beginning. The rain was coming down in sheets as we scrambled out of the van, grabbing our gear and making a dash for the relative shelter of the trees. The clearing Randy had chosen for our campsite was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded on all sides by towering pines and ancient oaks. In the fading light and through the curtain of rain, the forest seemed to press in on us, as if trying to reclaim this small patch of open ground. "Let's get the tents up!" Randy shouted over the rumble of thunder. We worked quickly, our hands fumbling with tent poles and guy lines as the rain soaked us to the skin. Chester and Lyle tackled one tent while Randy and I set up the other. Despite the rain and our haste, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced up at the tree line, I half expected to see that pale face again, peering out from behind a trunk or between the branches. With the tents finally erect, we hurried to get our gear inside and out of the rain. As I was making a final trip to the van, a flash of lightning illuminated the clearing. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw strange symbols carved into the bark of the trees surrounding us. crude, angular shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. But when I blinked, they were gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. Once we were all huddled in the tents, we took stock of our situation. We were wet, cold, and the camping trip was off to a less than ideal start. But as we changed into dry clothes and Randy broke out a bottle of whiskey he'd brought along for emergencies, our spirits began to lift. "Well, boys," Chester grinned, taking a swig from the bottle, "I'd say this qualifies as an adventure already." We laughed, the warm burn of the whiskey chasing away the chill and our unease. As the night wore on and the storm gradually subsided, we swapped stories and jokes, our voices low so as not to carry in the quiet forest. It was well past midnight when we finally settled down to sleep. The rain had tapered off to a gentle patter on the tent fly, and the forest around us was alive with the sounds of dripping water and the occasional call of a night bird. Despite my earlier misgivings, the rhythmic sounds lulled me toward sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A sound so faint I thought I might have imagined it, a tapping, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against wood. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from all around us, a gentle percussion that was somehow more unsettling than the loudest thunderclap. I lay there, fully awake now, straining my ears. The tapping continued, steady and unhurried. It didn't sound like an animal or any natural forest sound I could identify. It was too regular, too deliberate. "Randy," I whispered, nudging my tentmate. "Do you hear that?" Randy grunted and rolled over. "Hear what?" he mumbled sleepily. "That tapping sound, listen." We both fell silent. The tapping had stopped. The only sounds were the drip of water from the trees and Randy's breathing. "I don't hear anything, man," Randy yawned. "Probably just the trees settling or something. Get some sleep." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to dismiss it as my overtired mind playing tricks on me. But as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the forest was trying to communicate. Something that didn't want us here. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. My dreams were confused, fragmented things. I dreamt of pale faces peering from between the trees, of strange symbols glowing with an eldritch light, of a vast, unknowable presence that watched us with ancient, patient malevolence. I woke with the dawn, feeling unrested and on edge. As I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the misty morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft mud around our campsite, were footprints. But these were like no animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were too large, the shape all wrong, and they formed a perfect circle around our tents, as if whatever had made them had been pacing around us all night, watching, waiting. When I called the others out to look, the tracks were gone. The rising sun had dried the mud, leaving no trace of the nightmarish prints. My friends laughed off my story, attributing it to a vivid dream or an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had seen. As we set about making breakfast and planning our day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something ancient and dangerous. The forest around us no longer seemed like a refuge from civilization, but a place of hidden menace and lurking horrors. We were in its domain now, and it was watching us, waiting, and sooner or later I feared it would make its move. The day passed uneventfully, which only served to heighten my sense of impending doom. We hiked through the surrounding forest, Lyle snapping photos of the admittedly stunning scenery. Randy pointed out various plants and animal signs, clearly in his element. Chester kept up a steady stream of jokes and chatter, but I noticed his laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. Maybe I wasn't the only one feeling that something was off. As for me, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me like a shroud. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. More than once I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. The others noticed my jumpiness, but put it down to me being a city boy, unused to the deep woods. As the afternoon waned, we made our way back to the campsite. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us with grasping fingers. By unspoken agreement, we all stayed close to the campfire as night fell. The fire crackled merrily, a small circle of warmth and light in the growing darkness. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, shared more of Randy's whiskey, and tried to recapture the easy camaraderie of the previous evening. But there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Conversations would lapse into uneasy silences, only to be broken by nervous laughter or abrupt changes of subject. As the night deepened, the forest around us came alive with sound. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. But underneath it all, almost imperceptible, I could hear it again, the tapping, soft and rhythmic, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I wasn't the only one who noticed it this time. Chester was the first to mention it. "Hey, you guys hear that?" he asked, cocking his head to one side. We all fell silent, listening. The tapping grew slightly louder, as if encouraged by our attention. "Woodpecker?" Lyle suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Randy shook his head slowly. "No woodpecker I've ever heard, and not at night anyway." The tapping continued, steady and insistent. It seemed to be coming closer, the sound growing incrementally louder with each passing minute. Without realizing it, we had all drawn closer to the fire, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond its flickering light. That's when we saw them. Eyes, dozens of pairs of eyes reflecting the firelight surrounding our little camp. They were at various heights, some close to the ground, others higher up, as if their owners were clinging to the trees. And they were all focused on us. Chester let out a strangled yelp. "What the hell are those? Mountain lions?" Lyle whispered, his face pale in the firelight. But I knew these weren't any animal eyes I'd ever seen. They were too large, too intelligent. And the way they watched us was not with the predatory interest of a wild animal, but with an almost human-like curiosity, a malevolent, hungry curiosity. Randy, ever the voice of reason, tried to take charge. "Okay, everyone stay calm. Whatever they are, they're probably more afraid of us than we are of them. Let's just make some noise, show them we're not prey." We tried, we yelled, we banged pots and pans. We even threw burning sticks from the fire into the darkness. But the eyes didn't move. They didn't even blink. They just watched, unperturbed by our efforts to scare them away. And all the while, that infernal tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was no longer a gentle knocking, but a pounding that seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath our feet. Suddenly, Chester let out a blood-curdling scream. We all whipped around to see him pointing at something just beyond the firelight. There, emerging from between two ancient trees, was a figure. But it was like no human or animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and jointed in all the wrong places. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the firelight, stretched tight over a frame that seemed more bone than flesh. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. It was featureless, smooth as an egg, save for two enormous black eyes that reflected the firelight like polished onyx. As we watched, frozen in terror, more figures began to emerge from the forest. Some were similar to the first, while others were so bizarre and horrific that my mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. Shapes that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them, appendages that moved in impossible ways, faces that were a mockery of anything found in nature. The tapping had reached a fever pitch now, so loud it drowned out the sound of our own panicked breathing. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, everything was still. We stood there, a group of terrified humans surrounded by nightmarish entities that defied explanation. Then, as one, the creatures began to move towards us. "Run!" Randy's shout broke the spell. We turned and bolted, leaving everything behind as we plunged into the darkness of the forest. I had no idea where we were going. All I knew was that we had to get away from those things. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step. But I didn't slow down. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush around me, their panicked breathing matching my own, and behind us. I don't know how to describe the sounds that pursued us. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A cacophony of inhuman shrieks, guttural growls, and that omnipresent tapping that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Finally, we burst into a small clearing, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. As we lay there, gasping for breath, I realized with a jolt of terror that I could only hear 3 sets of breathing. Someone was missing. As the realization dawned on us, a new wave of panic set in. We scrambled to our feet, peering into the darkness that surrounded us. "Lyle?" Randy called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Lyle, where are you?" There was no response, just the eerie silence of the forest, punctuated by our ragged breathing. "He was right behind me," Chester said, his face pale in the dim moonlight that filtered through the trees. "I swear he was right there." We called Lyle's name again and again, our voices growing more desperate with each unanswered cry. But the forest remained silent, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. "We have to go back," I said, though every fiber of my being screamed against the idea. "We can't just leave him out there." Randy nodded grimly. "Amos is right. We stick together no matter what. But we need to be smart about this. Those things are still out there." We gathered what courage we had left and began to retrace our steps. The forest seemed different now, more sinister. Shadows danced at the edge of our vision, and every sound made us flinch. The memory of those pale, elongated figures was seared into my mind, and I kept expecting to see one looming over us at any moment. As we neared our campsite, that now familiar tapping started up again. It was softer this time, almost tentative, like it was testing our resolve. We pressed on, calling Lyle's name at regular intervals. When we finally broke through the tree line into our camp, I almost wished we hadn't. The site was in disarray. Our tents were shredded, their contents strewn about the clearing. The remnants of our fire smoldered weakly, casting just enough light to illuminate the destruction. But it was what we saw at the center of the clearing that made my blood run cold. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were strange symbols carved into the ground. They were similar to the ones I thought I'd seen on the trees earlier, but larger, more intricate. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And in the center of this eldritch circle was Lyle's camera, smashed to pieces. Chester let out a choked sob. What is this? What's happening?" Randy, always the level-headed one, tried to take charge. "Okay, let's not panic. We need to gather whatever supplies we can salvage and get out of here. We'll head back to the road and get help." But as we moved to gather our scattered belongings, the tapping started again, louder this time, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, surrounding us. Then, cutting through the rhythm of the tapping, we heard it. Lyle's voice, distant and distorted, calling for help. "Guys? Where are you? Help me!" We all froze, looking at each other in horror. The voice was Lyle's, but there was something off about it, something not quite right. "Lyle!" Randy shouted. "Where are you?" "Here, I'm here, follow my voice." The voice was coming from the depths of the forest, in the opposite direction from where we'd run earlier. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong, that we shouldn't trust it. But what choice did we have? As one, we moved towards the source of the voice. The tapping grew louder with each step, drowning out everything else. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. We pushed on, deeper into the forest. Lyle's voice grew louder, but also stranger. It began to distort, the words becoming garbled and inhuman, and yet we couldn't stop. It was as if we were being pulled along by some unseen force. Suddenly we burst into another clearing, and there in the center was Lyle, or something that looked like Lyle. He stood with his back to us, unnaturally still. When he slowly turned to face us, I felt my sanity begin to unravel. It had Lyle's face, but it was all wrong. The proportions were off, the features stretched and warped. And his eyes were solid black, reflecting the moonlight like pools of oil. "You came," it said in Lyle's voice, a grotesque parody of a smile stretching its face. "We've been waiting for so long." As it spoke, more figures began to emerge from the forest around us, the pale, elongated creatures we'd seen earlier, and others too horrible to describe. They formed a circle around us, cutting off any chance of escape. The tapping reached a crescendo, so loud now that it felt like my skull would split open. And as I stood there, surrounded by nightmares made flesh, I realized with a sickening certainty that our weekend adventure had become something else entirely. We had stumbled into a realm of ancient horrors, of things that should not be. And now we were part of it, whether we wanted to be or not. The last thing I remember before the world went dark was the Not Lyle reaching out to us with arms that were far too long, far too wrong, and that terrible, inhuman smile stretching wider and wider. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, the world around me was a blur of shadows and muted colors. My head throbbed with a pain that seemed to pulse in time with that infernal tapping, which had mercifully reduced to a distant, barely audible rhythm. As my vision cleared, I realized I was alone. Randy and Chester were nowhere to be seen. I was lying on the damp forest floor, surrounded by trees that seemed to loom over me, their branches casting strange, shifting shadows in the weak moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Panic seized me as the memories of what had happened came flooding back. The creatures, the Not Lyle, the overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated everything. I scrambled to my feet, fighting against the wave of nausea and dizziness that threatened to overwhelm me. "Randy? Chester?" I called out, my voice hoarse and weak. There was no response, just the subtle rustling of leaves in the gentle night breeze, and that ever-present, distant tapping. I had no idea where I was or which direction would lead me back to our campsite, or to safety. Every tree looked the same, every shadow concealing potential horrors. But I couldn't just stay there. I had to find the others, had to get out of this nightmare forest. Choosing a direction at random, I began to walk. Each step was an effort, my body protesting against movement, but the fear of what might be lurking in the darkness behind me spurred me on. As I walked, I began to notice things, strange things. The trees didn't look quite right. Their bark was too smooth in some places, too rough in others, and some of them seemed to be moving. Not swaying in the wind, but actually shifting position when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. This forest, this whole place, was wrong. It operated by rules that defied our understanding of reality. The tapping grew louder as I walked, guiding me like some twisted beacon. Part of me wanted to turn and run in the opposite direction, but a larger part, a part I didn't quite understand, compelled me to follow the sound. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this place, but eventually I came upon another clearing, and in the center of that clearing was Chester. Relief flooded through me at the sight of my friend. "Chester," I called out, rushing forward. But as I got closer, that relief turned to icy dread. Chester was standing unnaturally still, his back to me. As I approached, he slowly turned, and I saw that his face bore the same twisted wrongness that had marked the Not Lyle. His features were distorted, his eyes black and empty. "Amos," he said, his voice a horrific parody of my friend's, "you're just in time. The transformation is beautiful, isn't it?" I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move as more figures emerged from the forest around us. They were the same creatures we'd seen before, their elongated limbs and featureless faces now sickeningly familiar. What have you done to him?" I managed to choke out. The Not Chester tilted his head at an impossible angle, that terrifying smile stretching his face. "Done? We've freed him. Freed him from the limitations of his human form, and soon you'll be free too." The creatures were closing in now, their movements jerky and unnatural. The tapping had reached a fever pitch, reverberating through my body. In that moment, faced with the horrific fate that awaited me, something inside me snapped. With a strength born of pure terror, I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the creatures in pursuit, their movements accompanied by a cacophony of inhuman shrieks and that never-ending tapping. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out at any moment. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. To stop was to face a fate worse than death. As I ran, the forest around me began to change. The trees grew more twisted, more wrong. Faces seemed to peer out from the bark, silent screams frozen in the wood. The ground beneath my feet became spongy and uneven, pulsing like it was alive. And still I ran. Because somewhere in this nightmare realm, Randy was still out there. And as long as there was a chance he was still human, still himself, I had to find him. I had to believe there was still hope. But with each step, With each beat of that maddening tapping, I felt my grip on reality slipping. This place, these creatures, they defied everything I thought I knew about the world, and I was terrified that the longer I stayed here, the more I would become a part of it. As I crashed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth, I suddenly found myself on the edge of a vast, mist-shrouded clearing. And there in the center was a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was Randy. But it wasn't Randy. Not anymore. The clearing was vast, far larger than should have been possible given the dense forest we'd been traversing. Mist swirled around my ankles, thick and cloying, seeming to pull at me as I stood frozen at the edge of the tree line. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. In the center of the clearing stood Randy, or what had once been Randy. His body was elongated, stretched to impossible proportions. His skin had taken on the same pale, almost translucent quality as the creatures that had been pursuing us. But it was his face that truly made my sanity begin to fray at the edges. His features were in a state of constant flux, shifting and reforming like clay being molded by unseen hands. One moment I saw the Randy I knew, the next a nightmarish visage that belonged to no earthly creature. And his eyes were vast pools of swirling darkness, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. Amos, the thing that had been Randy, spoke, its voice a dissonant chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You're finally here. We've been waiting for you." I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and flee back into the relative safety of the forest, but I couldn't move. Whether it was fear that rooted me to the spot or some unseen force exerted by this place, I don't know. All I know is that I stood there, trembling, as the horror before me began to speak again. "Don't you see, Amos? This is evolution. This is transcendence. We are becoming something greater, something beyond the limitations of our frail human forms." As it spoke, more figures began to emerge from the mist. I recognized the twisted forms of Chester and Lyle among them, along with dozens of the pale, elongated creatures we'd encountered before. They formed a circle around Randy and me, their black eyes fixed upon us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The thing that had been Randy tilted its head at an impossible angle, its ever-shifting face settling for a moment into a grotesque parody of a smile. "We are the old ones. We are the watchers in the dark. We are what humanity fears in the depths of its collective unconscious. And now we are becoming one with this realm, and with you." As it spoke, tendrils of mist began to coil around my legs, crawling up my body like living things. I tried to move, to shake them off, but I was paralyzed. The mist continued its inexorable advance, seeping into my skin, my eyes, my mouth. I could feel it invading my body, my mind, rewriting the very essence of who I was. Memories began to flash before my eyes, but they weren't my memories. I saw vast cyclopean cities that predated humanity by eons. I saw creatures of such cosmic horror that my mind recoiled from their very concept. I saw the birth and death of universes, played out in an instant. And through it all I felt myself changing. My body was stretching, reforming. My consciousness was expanding, merging with something vast and alien and utterly incomprehensible. For a moment, I teetered on the brink of oblivion. I could feel my sense of self, everything that made me Amos Tillman, begin to dissolve into this greater, more terrible awareness. And a part of me wanted to let go, to surrender to this transcendent horror, and leave behind the limitations of my human existence. But in that moment, as I stood on the precipice of becoming something other than human, a small, defiant spark flared within me. A memory of who I was, of the life I'd lived, of my family, my friends, my hopes and dreams. And with every ounce of willpower I possessed, I clung to that spark. "No," I managed to gasp out, fighting against the invasion of my mind and body. I won't become this." With a Herculean effort, I forced my body to move. Each step was agony, like trying to walk through quicksand. The mist clung to me, trying to pull me back to complete the transformation. But I pushed on, one excruciating step at a time. The circle of creatures parted before me, Whether out of surprise at my resistance or some other unknowable reason, I couldn't tell. I stumbled past them, my vision blurring, my mind reeling from the assault of alien memories and sensations. Behind me I heard the thing that had been Randy let out a sound that was part shriek, part mournful wail. "You cannot escape us, Amos. We are everywhere. We are everything. You are already one of us." I didn't look back. I couldn't. I feared that if I saw that horrific visage again, my resolve would crumble. Instead, I focused every ounce of my being on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting away from that nightmarish clearing. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The world around me seemed to shift and warp, trees bending in impossible ways, shadows moving with a life of their own. That damnable tapping started up again, growing louder with each step I took. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning in this place. But eventually, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and found myself on a dirt road. In the distance I could see the faint glow of civilization. With the last of my strength I staggered towards those distant lights. As I walked, I could feel the alien presence in my mind receding like a tide going out. The mist that had clung to me dissipated, leaving me feeling hollow and drained. I don't remember much of what happened next. I have vague memories of collapsing on the side of the road, of bright lights and concerned voices. I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later, my body weak but human, blessedly human. The official story is that we got lost in the woods, that exposure and dehydration caused vivid hallucinations. They found Randy's van where we'd left it, but no sign of Randy, Chester, or Lyle. The search was called off after a week. They're listed as missing persons now, presumed dead. But I know the truth. I know what's out there in those woods. I know what they became, what I almost became. And I know that they're still out there, watching, waiting. I've tried to move on with my life. I left that small town in West Virginia, moved to the city where I'm surrounded by the comforting noise and light of civilization. But at night in my dreams I still hear that tapping. I still see those shifting, impossible faces. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, a part of me is still out there in those woods, forever changed by what I experienced. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, it doesn't change what happened. But if you ever find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains and you hear a strange tapping in the woods, run. Run and don't look back, because they're out there and they're always watching, always waiting for new souls to join their eldritch ranks. As for me, I'll keep living my life, keep trying to forget. But a part of me knows that one day they'll come for me again. And when that day comes, I don't know if I'll have the strength to resist a second time. The weeks and months following my escape from the forest were a blur of hospital stays, police interviews, and psychological evaluations. The authorities were baffled by my story, unable to reconcile my vivid, terrifying account with the lack of physical evidence. They chalked it up to trauma-induced delusions, a mental break caused by the stress of getting lost in the wilderness and losing my friends. But I knew the truth. The memories of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, were seared into my mind with a clarity that no hallucination could match. The problem was, I couldn't prove any of it. The forest had reclaimed any trace of our campsite, and subsequent searches turned up no sign of Randy, Chester, or Lyle. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The families of my missing friends were devastated. I attended memorial services, watched as empty caskets were lowered into the ground. The guilt was overwhelming. I was the sole survivor, the only one who knew what had really happened, and yet I couldn't provide any closure. How could I tell Randy's mother that her son had become something inhuman, something that defied explanation? How could I describe to Lyle's fiancée the horror of seeing his face twisted into that grotesque parody of itself? So I stayed silent. I nodded along as the police and psychologists spun their theories of what had happened. I accepted the diagnosis of PTSD, took the prescribed medications, attended the mandated therapy sessions. On the surface, I played the part of the traumatized survivor, slowly healing and moving on with my life. But inside I was haunted, not just by the memories of what I'd seen, but by the lingering effects of my near transformation. Sometimes late at night, I would catch glimpses of impossible geometries in the shadows of my room. I would hear whispers in languages that no human tongue could pronounce. And always, always, there was that tapping, faint but persistent, like a countdown to some inevitable, horrific reunion. I tried to research what had happened to us, to find some explanation in folklore or fringe science. I pored over books on cryptozoology, on alternate dimensions, on forgotten cults and eldritch horrors. But nothing I found quite matched what we had encountered. It was as if those creatures, those old ones, as the thing that was Randy had called them, existed in a blind spot of human knowledge, too terrible for our collective consciousness to acknowledge. As the months turned into years, I slowly rebuilt my life. I moved to a big city as far from the Appalachian wilderness as I could get. I threw myself into my work, into new hobbies, into anything that could distract me from the memories that still lurked at the edges of my mind. I even tried to form new relationships, but they always fell apart. How could I truly connect with someone when I was carrying this terrible secret? But no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That what had happened in those woods was just the beginning of something larger, something that would one day engulf not just me, but all of humanity. And so here I am, years later, finally putting this story down in writing. Not because I expect anyone to believe me, but because I need to get it out. I need someone, anyone, to know what's out there, what's waiting in the dark corners of our world. To those who read this, I have a warning. The world is not what you think it is. Reality is thin, fragile, and there are things lurking just beyond the veil that defy comprehension. If you value your sanity, your very humanity, be careful where you tread. Because once you've glimpsed what lies beyond, there's no going back. As for me, I don't know what the future holds. Part of me hopes that by sharing this story I can finally find some peace, some closure. But a larger part knows better. Because deep down, in a place I try to ignore, I can feel it. The tapping is getting louder, the shadows are growing longer. And somewhere out there in a forest that doesn't quite obey the laws of our reality, they're waiting for me. They're always waiting. And one day I fear they'll come to finish what they started. I never thought a quiet day off would turn into the most harrowing experience of my life. My name is Branson Whitaker, and this happened last year in 2023. I'd taken a trip out to the woods near Red Rock Canyon in Nevada, needing some solitude away from my usual grind. I'm not much of a wilderness expert, but I like the calm and the quiet. I thought it'd be a good way to clear my head after dealing with a tough breakup. The morning was perfect, the sun peeking through the trees, the air crisp and fresh. I parked my car at a trailhead and started hiking. It wasn't supposed to be a long hike, just a loop that'd bring me back by afternoon. I had my backpack with some water, snacks, and a first aid kit. Standard stuff. I didn't carry a gun because I never really felt the need for one. Maybe that was a mistake, but I wasn't about to turn back. As I set out on the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. I chalked it up to my city dweller paranoia and pressed on. The path wound through dense pines, their needles carpeting the ground and muffling my footsteps. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of the red rock formations that gave the canyon its name. Their stark beauty a stark contrast to the lush greenery around me. I paused to take a photo with my phone, realizing as I did that I had no signal out here. It was oddly liberating, being cut off from the world. No emails, no texts, no reminders of the life I was trying to escape for a day. I tucked the phone away and continued on, my boots crunching on the rocky trail. The air grew thicker as I climbed higher, the elevation making each breath a little more labored. I welcomed the physical exertion, feeling it purge the stress and anxiety that had been weighing me down. With each step I felt lighter, more in tune with my surroundings. But there was something else, too, a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was just being dramatic. After all, what could possibly go wrong on a simple day hike? As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came across a small clearing. A fallen log lay across the path. and I decided it was as good a place as any to take a break. I sat down, pulling out my water bottle and taking a long drink. The coolness of the water was a welcome relief against the growing heat of the day. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. The distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft gurgle of a nearby stream. It was peaceful, idyllic even. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes snapped open, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no animals, no rustling bushes, just the silent, impassive forest staring back at me. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair. "Get it together, Branson," I muttered to myself. "You're out here to relax, not freak yourself out." I stood up, stretching my legs and adjusting my backpack. As I did, something caught my eye. Just off the trail, partially hidden by a bush, was a strange marking on a tree. Curious, I stepped closer to get a better look. The bark had been stripped away in a long vertical gash. At first I thought it might have been caused by a bear, but the marks were too uniform, too deliberate. They almost looked like claw marks, but larger than any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. A chill ran down my spine as I traced the marks with my fingers. They were deep, cutting into the heartwood of the tree. Whatever had made them was powerful, and judging by how fresh they looked, it had been here recently. I stepped back, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just moments ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every shadow held potential danger, every rustle of leaves a possible predator. I debated turning back, cutting my hike short and heading back to the safety of my car. But something inside me, a mixture of curiosity and stubbornness, urged me to continue. After all, I reasoned, I was probably just letting my imagination run wild. There had to be a logical explanation for the marks, and I was determined to finish my hike as planned. With one last look at the scarred tree, I set off down the trail again. But this time my steps were quicker, more purposeful. The peaceful solitude I'd sought had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety, a feeling that I was no longer a welcome guest in these woods, but an intruder in a place I didn't fully understand. As I walked, I couldn't shake the image of those claw marks from my mind. What kind of creature could have made them? And more importantly, was it still out here, somewhere in the depths of the forest? I pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the path ahead. But with each step, I felt the weight of the forest pressing in around me, watching, waiting. Little did I know my decision to continue would lead me into a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. Around midday, I found a nice spot near a small creek to have lunch. I remember sitting there thinking about how peaceful everything was. I didn't have any signal out there, which was fine by me. It forced me to disconnect, to focus on the moment. I had a sandwich and an apple, leaning back against a rock, listening to the water gurgle and the birds sing. It was idyllic, really, a perfect slice of nature. As I ate, I tried to shake off the unease that had been building since I'd seen those strange claw marks. The serene setting helped, but I couldn't completely relax. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense up, expecting to see some monstrous creature emerge from the underbrush. I finished my lunch quickly, not wanting to linger too long in one spot. As I packed up my trash, I always made sure to leave no trace. I noticed something odd about the creek. The water, which had been clear and inviting when I first sat down, now seemed murky and unsettling. I leaned in for a closer look, and my breath caught in my throat. Floating on the surface of the water were tufts of coarse, dark hair. Not just one or two, but dozens, as if some large animal had taken a swim upstream. But that wasn't what sent a chill down my spine. Mixed in with the hair were small bone fragments, bleached white by the sun and water. I recoiled, nearly losing my balance and falling into the creek. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be from a deer or some other large animal that had fallen victim to a predator? But the bones looked too small, too delicate. With a sickening realization, I wondered if they might be human. I scrambled to my feet, suddenly eager to put as much distance between myself and the creek as possible. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye on the opposite bank. Half hidden in the mud was a piece of fabric, tattered and stained. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. To my horror, I realized it was a shred of clothing, a torn piece of what looked like a hiking boot. My heart pounding, I grabbed my backpack and set off down the trail at a brisk pace. The peaceful atmosphere of earlier had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the woods, stalking me. As I walked, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just debris from careless hikers or the remains of some unfortunate animal. But deep down, I knew that didn't add up. The claw marks on the tree, the hair and bones in the creek, the torn boot, it all pointed to something sinister, something that didn't belong in these woods. I picked up my pace, no longer enjoying the hike, but focused solely on getting back to my car as quickly as possible. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, each turn revealing more of the same dense forest. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, startling at every sound. That's when things started to feel truly off. I noticed the forest had gone quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe I was overreacting. But then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Ahead of me on the trail were footprints, big ones, way too big to be human. I'm no tracker, but I knew these weren't from any animal I'd ever seen. They were deeply imprinted in the soft earth of the trail, each one easily twice the size of my own boot. The shape was vaguely human-like, but distorted, with long claw-like toe marks at the end of each print. Curiosity warred with fear as I stood there, staring at the tracks. Part of me screamed to turn back, to run as fast as I could back to the safety of civilization. But another part, the part that had always gotten me into trouble, urged me to investigate further. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to follow the prints, which led off the trail and deeper into the woods. I don't know what I was thinking, but it felt like something out of a mystery novel, and I couldn't help myself. As I moved further in, the trees seemed to close in around me. The light dimmed and the air grew colder. I pushed through dense underbrush, my clothes catching on thorns and branches. The footprints were easier to follow here, carving a clear path through the untouched forest floor. Whatever had made them was heavy, powerful enough to crush the vegetation beneath its feet. As I pressed on, the silence of the forest became oppressive. There were no birds calling, no insects buzzing, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. It was as if all life had fled, leaving behind an empty, haunted woodland. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a gnarled old tree. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of pine and earth, but as I stood there it grew stronger, a rank musky odor that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. It reminded me of rotting meat and wet fur, an unholy combination that spoke of decay and feral aggression. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to forget this foolish quest and run for safety. But I'd come too far now. I had to know what was out here, what was leaving these massive tracks and filling the air with that awful stench. With a deep breath, I pushed on, following the trail of footprints and broken vegetation. The forest grew darker, the canopy above so thick that only slivers of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. I fumbled in my backpack for my flashlight, grateful I'd thought to bring it along. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating a path ahead. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, I saw a glimpse. A massive, hulking figure moving between the trees. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't any animal I recognized. It walked on two legs, and its shape was vaguely humanoid but distorted, like something out of a nightmare. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. Was this Bigfoot? It sounded ridiculous, but there it was, right in front of me. I must have made a noise because it turned its head in my direction. That's when I saw its face, and it wasn't anything I'd imagined. It had a flat, broad nose and a mouth filled with sharp, irregular teeth. Its eyes, set deep in a sloped forehead, gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. It looked almost human, but its features were twisted, monstrous. Fear surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I ran like hell, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. I just needed to get away. My mind was racing and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, getting closer. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I kept running. The creature's heavy breathing and the sound of snapping trees filled my ears. It was gaining on me, its longer stride eating up the distance between us. I burst out of the tree line onto the main trail, hope surging through me. If I could just make it back to my car, I'd be safe. But as I ran, I realized with growing horror that I was lost. In my panic, I'd lost all sense of direction. I had no idea which way led back to the trailhead and which would take me deeper into this nightmare. With no other choice, I picked a direction and ran, praying it was the right one. Behind me, I could hear the creature closing in, its thunderous footsteps shaking the ground. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, but it wasn't enough. Suddenly, I tripped on a root and went down hard, scraping my knee and tearing my jeans. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. The creature was there, standing over me, its massive form blotting out the sky. I grabbed a branch and swung it wildly, more out of desperation than anything. It roared. No, not a roar, more like a bellow, deep and guttural. It swiped at me with a massive hand, and I felt a searing pain across my chest as its claws raked through my shirt and skin. I staggered back, clutching my chest. Blood seeped through my fingers, warm and sticky. I thought this was it, that I was done for. The creature loomed over me, its mouth open in a terrible grimace, saliva dripping from its yellowed teeth. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a gunshot. The creature howled and turned away from me, distracted. I looked up and saw a man with a rifle firing at the beast. He yelled at me to get up and run. I didn't need to be told twice. I pushed myself up and bolted, following the man who was already running in the opposite direction. We didn't stop until we reached a small cabin hidden away in the trees. He ushered me inside and bolted the door. I collapsed on the floor, trying to catch my breath, my chest burning with pain. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and it had nearly killed me. As I sat there, shaking and bleeding, I realized that my understanding of the world had been forever changed. There were things out there in the darkness, things that defied explanation. And I had a feeling that my nightmare was far from over. The man who had saved me introduced himself as Gideon Leclerc. He lived out here off the grid and said he'd seen the creature before. According to him, it was some kind of local legend, a beast that had haunted these woods for generations. Gideon was a character, tough as nails, but with a sense of humor that caught me off guard. He looked to be in his 60s, with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His cabin was Spartan but well organized, filled with books, maps, and what looked like hunting trophies. As he patched me up using supplies from a first aid kit that looked older than me, Gideon told me about others who had encountered the beast and hadn't been as lucky. His voice was gruff but not unkind as he worked, cleaning my wounds with a steady hand. "You know," he said, tying off a bandage, "I once tried to shoot that thing with a crossbow. Didn't do much but piss it off. Bet you've never seen a pissed-off Bigfoot, huh?" I laughed, despite the pain. "No, can't say I have. Thanks for saving my ass back there." "Don't mention it," Gideon replied, his eyes twinkling. "You city folks always think the woods are all fun and games. Nature's got a way of reminding you who's boss." As he worked, Gideon filled me in on what he knew about the creature. According to local lore, it had been around for centuries, preying on lone travelers and unwary hikers. Some called it Bigfoot, others had different names for it, but all agreed it was something to be feared. "It's not just some dumb animal," Gideon explained, his face serious. "It's smart, cunning. It learns from its encounters with humans. That's what makes it so dangerous." I listened intently, my mind reeling from the implications. But how is this possible? Why hasn't anyone reported it, studied it? Gideon's laugh was bitter. "Oh, people have tried. Scientists, cryptozoologists, even a few government types. But the creature's too good at hiding. And those who do see it, well, most don't live to tell the tale." He stood up, moving to the window and peering out into the gathering darkness. "As for reports, there have been plenty over the years. But who's going to believe stories about a monster in the woods? Most folks write it off as tall tales, or the ravings of people who've spent too much time alone in the wilderness." I thought about how I would have reacted if someone had told me this story just a day ago. I probably would have laughed it off too. Now, with my chest aching from the creature's claws, I wasn't laughing anymore. "So why are you out here?" I asked. "If you know how dangerous it is, why stay?" Gideon turned back to me, his eyes hard. "Someone's got to keep an eye on it. Try to protect folks who wander in unprepared, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to stop it for good." We spent the next few hours in the cabin, Gideon keeping his rifle close and peering out the window every so often. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. What the hell was that thing? And why was it out here? As night fell, the forest outside seemed to come alive with sounds. Every creak and rustle put me on edge. Gideon handed me an old revolver. "Just in case," he said. "You ever fired one of these before?" I shook my head. "No, but I guess now's a good time to learn." He gave me a quick rundown on how to use it, and I tried to steady my hands as I held the weapon. The reality of the situation was sinking in. We were trapped out here with a monster that shouldn't exist, and I had no idea if we'd make it through the night. "So what's your story?" Gideon asked as we sat in the dim light of an oil lamp. "What brought you out to these parts?" I hesitated, then figured I might as well be honest. I was trying to clear my head after a bad breakup. Thought a nice hike in the woods would do the trick. Guess I got more than I bargained for. Gideon nodded sympathetically. "Life's funny that way. You think you're running from one problem, only to stumble into something much bigger." "What about you?" I asked. "How did you end up out here hunting monsters?" Gideon's face darkened. "It's a long story. Let's just say I've got my reasons for wanting to see that creature put down." I wanted to press for more details, but something in Gideon's expression told me not to push it. Instead, I asked, "Do you think we're safe here? In the cabin, I mean?" Gideon shrugged. "Safe as we can be, I reckon. The creature's strong, but it's not stupid. It knows I'm armed, knows the cabin's defensible. It'll probably wait, try to catch us off guard." His words weren't exactly comforting, but I appreciated his honesty. We lapsed into silence, both lost in our own thoughts as the night deepened around us. Around midnight we heard it, a low rumbling growl outside the cabin. The creature was back, and it sounded angry. Gideon motioned for me to stay quiet, and we both listened as the sound moved closer. The cabin door rattled, and I gripped the revolver tighter, praying it wouldn't come in. My palms were sweaty, my heart pounding so loud I was sure the creature could hear it. Suddenly the door burst open, wood splintering, as the creature forced its way inside. Gideon fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. The shot hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely flinched. I raised the revolver, my hand shaking. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil nearly knocking me over. The bullet hit its shoulder, and it roared in pain, a sound that shook the very foundations of the cabin. "Keep shooting!" Gideon yelled, and I did, emptying the chamber into the beast. It staggered back, blood oozing from its wounds, but it wasn't done. With a last desperate effort, it lunged at Gideon, claws outstretched. Without thinking, I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and threw myself at the creature, stabbing it in the back. It howled and thrashed, throwing me off, but the distraction was enough. Gideon fired one last shot, hitting it in the head. The creature fell, crashing to the floor with a final shuddering breath. We both stood there panting, staring at the lifeless body. I couldn't believe it. We'd killed it. I slumped against the wall, feeling the adrenaline drain away, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Gideon lowered his rifle and looked at me with a grim smile. "Hell of a day, huh?" "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. "Hell of a day." As the reality of what we'd just done sank in, I realized that this was just the beginning. We'd killed a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, and I had a feeling that our troubles were far from over. The aftermath was a blur. Gideon called in some favors, and a few locals came to help us deal with the body. They arrived in the pre-dawn hours, grim-faced men and women who looked like they'd seen their fair share of strange things in these woods. They didn't seem surprised by the creature's appearance, which was both reassuring and unsettling. How long had they known about this? How many of these things were out there? One of the newcomers, a stern-faced woman Gideon introduced as Maria, took charge of the situation. "We need to burn it," she said, her voice brooking no argument. It's the only way to be sure it won't come back. I didn't argue. I was just glad to be alive and more than happy to let these people, who seemed to know what they were doing, take over. As they prepared for the grim task, Gideon pulled me aside. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice low. "What happened here tonight, it doesn't leave these woods. You understand?" I nodded, still too shocked to fully process everything. Who would believe me anyway? Gideon's grip on my arm tightened. "I'm serious. There are people out there who would do anything to get their hands on proof of this creature's existence. Bad people. It's better for everyone if this stays our secret." The gravity in his voice sobered me up quickly. I realized that by surviving this encounter, I had stumbled into something much bigger than I could have imagined. "I understand," I said, meeting his gaze. "I won't say a word." He seemed satisfied with my response and turned back to help the others. I watched as they doused the creature's body in gasoline and set it ablaze. The smell was horrible. Burning hair and something else, something alien and wrong. As the flames consumed the body, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and regret. Relief that the immediate danger was over, but regret that such a unique creature had to die. Despite the terror it had caused, there was something almost tragic about its demise. Maria approached me as we watched the fire. "First time seeing one of these?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the flames. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "It gets easier," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But you never quite forget your first encounter." As the sun rose, I realized I hadn't slept at all. The adrenaline that had kept me going through the night was wearing off, leaving me feeling drained and slightly disconnected from reality. Gideon offered to drive me back to my car, and I gladly accepted. As we prepared to leave, Maria pulled me aside one last time. "Remember," she said, her voice low and intense, "what happens in these woods stays in these woods, for your own safety and for ours." I nodded, understanding the weight of the secret I now carried. As Gideon and I set off, I cast one last look at the smoldering remains of the creature. The events of the past night felt surreal, like a vivid nightmare I couldn't quite shake off. We didn't talk much on the way back to my car. There wasn't much to say. What do you talk about after a night like that? The forest looked different in the morning light, less threatening, but now holding secrets I could never unsee. When we reached the trailhead where my car was parked, I thanked Gideon again. "I owe you my life," I said, meaning every word. He waved off my thanks. "Just be more careful next time, city boy. The woods aren't as friendly as they look." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie with this grizzled old man who had saved my life and introduced me to a world I never knew existed. As I got into my car, Gideon leaned in. "Listen," he said, his voice serious. "If you ever need anything or if you see anything unusual, you call this number." He handed me a scrap of paper with a phone number scrawled on it. I took it, understanding the significance of what he was offering. "I will," I promised. With a final nod, Gideon stepped back and I started my car. As I drove away, I watched him in my rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the woods like a sentinel. The drive back to the city was surreal. The normalcy of traffic and buildings felt jarring after what I had experienced. I kept replaying the events in my mind, half convinced I had imagined it all, but the bandages on my chest and the ache in my muscles were very real reminders of what had happened, as were the nightmares that would plague me in the weeks to come. Back in the city, life went on. I got back to work, dealt with my breakup, and tried to move forward. But everything felt different now. The world seemed bigger, more mysterious, and infinitely more dangerous. I'd find myself staring at the woods on the outskirts of the city, wondering what secrets they held. I'd think about that day in the woods, wonder what that creature was, where it had come from, and if there were more out there. And sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet, I'd hear something that sounded like a distant, inhuman howl, and I'd wonder if maybe, just maybe, there were more of those creatures out there, waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of civilization. The phone number Gideon had given me burned a hole in my pocket. I knew that if I called it, I'd be opening a door to a world I might not be ready for. But part of me, the part that had followed those tracks into the woods, was tempted. For now, though, I kept the number tucked away, a reminder of the day my world changed forever. a reminder that sometimes the monsters in the woods are all too real. Weeks passed, and life in the city slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the memories of that day in the woods haunted me, coloring every aspect of my life. I found myself jumping at shadows, startling at unexpected noises. Sleep became a luxury, my nights plagued by vivid nightmares of glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. Work suffered. I couldn't focus, my mind constantly drifting back to the encounter. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden movements. They attributed it to my recent breakup, and I didn't correct them. How could I explain what really happened? One particularly bad night, after waking up in a cold sweat for the third time, I found myself staring at the scrap of paper Gideon had given me. The phone number seemed to taunt me, a lifeline to answers I both craved and feared. With shaking hands, I dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as I was about to hang up, convinced it was a mistake, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" I froze, suddenly unsure of what to say. Is this Gideon?" There was a pause, then, "Who's asking?" "It's Branson, from the woods, the cabin." Another pause, longer this time. When Gideon spoke again, his voice was low, urgent. "Are you okay? Have you seen something?" "No, I'm fine. I can't stop thinking about what happened. I need to understand." Gideon sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "Meet me at the diner off Highway 50 tomorrow at noon. Come alone." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there, phone in hand, wondering what I'd just set in motion. The next day, I found myself at a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. Gideon was already there, nursing a cup of coffee at a corner booth. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes shadowed. "You look like hell, kid," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "Feel like it too," I admitted. "I can't shake what happened. I need answers, Gideon." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but not here. Too many ears." We left the diner and drove in Gideon's beat-up truck to a secluded spot overlooking the city. As we sat there, Gideon told me everything he knew about the creature, or creatures. As it turned out, there was more than one. "They've been around for centuries," he explained. "Native legends talk about them, early settlers had encounters, but they've always been good at staying hidden." "But what are they?" I asked. "Some kind of undiscovered species?" Gideon shook his head. "It's not that simple. These things, they're not just animals. They're intelligent, maybe as smart as us. And they're changing, adapting." He went on to explain how the creatures had been evolving, becoming more adept at avoiding detection, more aggressive in their encounters with humans. "It's like they're preparing for something," he said, his voice grim. "A war, maybe, against us." As Gideon talked, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was bigger than I'd imagined, more terrifying than I'd dared to consider. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked. Gideon turned to me, his eyes intense. "Because you've seen them now. You're part of this, whether you like it or not. And we need all the help we can get." "Help with what?" "Protecting people, keeping these things in check, and maybe someday finding a way to coexist." I sat back, my mind reeling. This wasn't what I'd expected when I'd called Gideon. I'd hoped for explanations, for a way to put my experience behind me. Instead, I was being pulled deeper into a world I barely understood. "I don't know if I can do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Gideon's hand on my shoulder was surprisingly gentle. "I know it's a lot to take in, but you've got a choice to make now. You can try to forget what you saw, go back to your life and pretend it never happened. Or you can join us, help make a difference." I looked out over the city, thinking about all the people down there, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the wilderness beyond. Could I really turn my back on this knowledge? "I need some time to think," I said finally. Gideon nodded. "Take all the time you need. But remember, those things out there aren't waiting. They're getting stronger, bolder, and sooner or later they're going to make their move." As I got out of Gideon's truck back at the diner, he handed me a small worn journal. "Read this," he said. "It might help you understand what we're up against." I took the journal, feeling its weight in my hands. As Gideon drove away, I realized that my life had irrevocably changed. The normalcy I'd been clinging to was an illusion. I was standing on the precipice of a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. That night, I sat up reading Gideon's journal. It was filled with accounts of encounters with the creatures, theories about their origins, and strategies for tracking and fighting them. The more I read, the more I realized how little I truly knew about the world around me. As dawn broke, I made my decision. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't unknow what I now knew. The world had changed for me, and I had to change with it. I called Gideon as soon as it was a reasonable hour. "I'm in," I said without preamble. "Whatever this is, whatever you need me to do, I'm in." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Gideon's gruff voice came through. "Good. Meet me at the trailhead where we first met. Tomorrow, 6 a.m., pack for a long hike." The line went dead before I could ask any questions. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to wrap my head around what I was getting myself into. I called in sick to work, knowing I couldn't focus on mundane tasks with what lay ahead. The next morning I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. Gideon was already there, looking as if he hadn't slept. He nodded in greeting, then handed me a backpack. "Everything you need is in there," he said. "Follow me and stay quiet." We set off into the woods, moving at a brisk pace. Gideon seemed to know exactly where he was going, navigating the unmarked terrain with ease. As we walked, he began to explain. "What you saw that night wasn't an isolated incident," he said, his voice low. "These creatures, we call them shadows. They're becoming more active, more aggressive. We think they're preparing for something big." "We?" I asked, panting slightly as we climbed a steep incline. "There's a group of us," Gideon replied. "People who've encountered the shadows and lived to tell about it. We've banded together to try and understand them, to protect others." We continued on in silence for a while, the forest growing denser around us. I noticed signs I hadn't picked up on before. Claw marks on trees, strange tracks in the soft earth. The woods felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before, teeming with hidden dangers. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, similar to the one where I'd first fought the shadow. "Welcome to base camp," Gideon said, a hint of irony in his voice. Inside, the cabin was a hive of activity. Maps covered the walls, marked with sightings and encounters. A group of people huddled around a table, deep in discussion. They looked up as we entered, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. "This is Branson," Gideon announced. "He's joining us." The next few hours were a whirlwind of introductions and explanations. I met Maria, the stern woman from the night we killed the shadow, along with others. Jake, a former park ranger. Dr. Elaine Chen, a biologist specializing in undiscovered species. And Tom, a grizzled ex-military man who seemed to constantly be cleaning an impressive array of weapons. They filled me in on what they knew about the shadows. The creatures were ancient, predating human civilization. They'd always been part of the ecosystem, apex predators that kept to themselves. But something had changed in recent years. The shadows were becoming more numerous, more aggressive, encroaching on human territories. "We think they're reacting to climate change," Dr. Chen explained. "As their habitats shrink, they're adapting, evolving at an unprecedented rate, and they see us as a threat." "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scale of what we were facing. Tom spoke up, his voice gravelly. "We fight, we protect people, and we try to find a way to coexist before this turns into a war neither side can win." As night fell, Gideon took me aside. "You've got one last chance to back out," he said. "Once you're in, there's no going back to your old life. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, always wondering what's out there in the dark." I thought about my life in the city, the job I'd left behind, the normalcy I'd been clinging to. Then I thought about the terror of that night in the woods, and the realization that others might face the same if we didn't do something. "I'm staying," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Gideon nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Get some rest. Training starts at dawn." That night, as I lay on a cot in the corner of the cabin, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, I realized that my life had irrevocably changed. I was no longer Branson Whitaker, office worker and weekend hiker. I was now part of something bigger, something that straddled the line between reality and nightmare. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The real challenges, the real dangers still lay ahead. But for the first time since that fateful day in the woods, I felt a sense of purpose. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. The next few weeks were a blur of intense training and startling revelations. Every day, I pushed my body to its limits, learning survival skills, tracking techniques, and even basic combat. Tom, the ex-military man, was a harsh but effective teacher, drilling into us the importance of constant vigilance. "The shadows are always watching," he'd say, his eyes scanning the tree line. "The moment you let your guard down is the moment they strike." Dr. Chen's lessons were equally intense, but in a different way. She taught us about the shadows' biology, their behavior patterns, and their incredible ability to adapt. "They're not just animals," she explained one evening, her eyes alight with a mix of fear and fascination. "They're intelligent, possibly even sentient. We need to understand them if we hope to find a peaceful solution." But it was Gideon's lessons that truly opened my eyes to the world we were dealing with. He taught me how to read the forest, to see the signs of shadow activity that I'd missed before. Under his tutelage, the woods transformed from a place of terror to a complex ecosystem, one where humans were no longer at the top of the food chain. One day, about a month into my training, Gideon took me on a solo expedition deep into shadow territory. We hiked for hours, moving silently through the dense underbrush. As we walked, I noticed the forest changing subtly. The plants seemed different, more primordial somehow. The air felt thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Finally, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled. But what caught my attention were the markings carved into its bark, intricate symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gideon's face was grim. "This is why I brought you out here. You need to understand what we're really dealing with." He approached the tree, running his hand over the symbols. "These markings are old, older than any human civilization. The shadows didn't just appear one day. They've been here all along, watching, waiting." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Waiting for what?" Gideon turned to me, his eyes intense. "For the right moment, for when the balance shifts." He went on to explain a theory that Dr. Chen had been developing. The shadows weren't just reacting to climate change. They were actively working to reshape the environment. The increase in sightings, the more aggressive behavior, it was all part of a larger plan. "We think they're trying to reclaim the world," Gideon said, "to push humanity back and restore the old order." I stared at the tree, my mind reeling. But why now? What's changed? Gideon's laugh was bitter. "We have. Our cities, our pollution, our destruction of natural habitats. We've upset the balance, and now the shadows are stepping in to correct it." As we made our way back to camp, I peppered Gideon with questions. How long had they known about this? What were we going to do? Could we stop it? "We don't have all the answers," Gideon admitted. "But that's why we need people like you. Fresh eyes, new perspectives. We're in uncharted territory here, kid." That night back at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the ancient tree, about the Shadow's plan. It was almost too much to comprehend. We weren't just dealing with a dangerous animal species. We were up against an intelligent force that had been shaping the world long before humans came along. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard a commotion outside. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet. I bolted upright, my heart racing. Tom burst into the cabin, his face pale. "We've got a situation," he said. "A shadow's been spotted on the edge of town. It's not retreating." In an instant, the cabin was a flurry of activity. Weapons were distributed, plans quickly formed. As we prepared to head out, Gideon pulled me aside. "You ready for this?" he asked, his eyes searching my face. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I'd learned in the past few weeks. "As ready as I'll ever be." Gideon nodded, clapping me on the shoulder. "Remember your training, and remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who doesn't know the truth, for the future of our species." As we piled into vehicles and sped towards town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something momentous. The shadows were making their move, stepping out of the darkness and into our world. And we were the only ones who stood a chance of stopping them. The streets were eerily quiet as we entered the town, the silence broken only by the occasional distant scream or sound of breaking glass. We split into teams, moving cautiously through the deserted streets. I was paired with Maria, her stern face set in grim determination. As we turned a corner, we saw it. The shadow loomed at the end of the street, its massive form silhouetted against the glow of a burning car. It turned towards us, its eyes gleaming with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I thought about everything that had led me to this moment, the hike that had changed my life, the weeks of training, the revelations about the true nature of our world. I thought about all the people in this town, blissfully unaware of the ancient conflict playing out on their streets. Then the moment passed, and the shadow charged. As I raised my weapon, I knew that this was just the beginning. The real war was just starting, and the fate of humanity hung in the balance. The shadow's charge was terrifyingly swift, its massive form eating up the distance between us in seconds. Maria and I split up, diving to opposite sides of the street. I rolled behind a parked car, my heart pounding in my ears. "Distract it!" Maria yelled, her voice barely audible over the creature's thunderous footsteps. I popped up from behind the car, firing off a series of shots. The bullets seemed to do little more than annoy the shadow, but it was enough to draw its attention. It turned towards me, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intelligence. As it approached, I could see details I'd missed in our first encounter. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, covered in what looked like bioluminescent patterns that pulsed and shifted. Its movements were more fluid than I remembered, almost graceful despite its enormous size. I kept firing, backing up as the shadow advanced. Where was Maria? I chanced a glance around and saw her circling behind the creature, a strange device in her hands. Suddenly, the shadow lunged forward faster than I could react. Its massive hand swept towards me, and I felt a searing pain as its claws raked across my arm. I stumbled backwards, my gun clattering to the ground. Just as the shadow was about to strike again, a high-pitched whine filled the air. The creature recoiled, roaring in pain or anger. I couldn't tell which. Maria stood behind it, the device in her hands emitting a pulsing blue light. "It's working," she shouted. "Keep it distracted." I scrambled for my gun, ignoring the pain in my arm. The shadow was thrashing now, caught between advancing on me and retreating from whatever Maria was doing. I fired again, aiming for its eyes. One shot connected, and the creature let out a bellow that shook the windows of nearby buildings. It turned fully towards me, rage evident in its sole remaining eye. I backed up, my finger tight on the trigger, but the gun just clicked. Empty. Time seemed to slow down as the shadow charged. I could see every detail, the saliva dripping from its razor-sharp teeth, the muscles rippling under its strange skin, the intelligence and fury burning in its eye. Just as I thought it was over, a deafening roar split the air. A truck came barreling down the street, slamming into the shadow's side. The creature was thrown off its feet, crashing into a storefront in a shower of glass and debris. Gideon leaned out of the truck's window, his face a mask of grim determination. "Get in!" he yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted for the truck, diving into the back as Maria jumped into the passenger seat. Gideon floored it, the engine roaring as we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shadow emerging from the wreckage of the store. It looked at our retreating vehicle, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something in its gaze, not just anger or hunger, but a cold, calculating intelligence, a promise of retribution. Then we turned a corner, and it was gone. The drive back to the cabin was tense and silent. My arm throbbed where the shadow had clawed me, and my mind was reeling from the encounter. It had been different this time. The creature had seemed more purposeful, more intelligent. This wasn't just a predator hunting prey. This was something else entirely. Back at the cabin, Dr. Chen patched up my arm while the others debriefed. The device Maria had used was some kind of sonic emitter, designed to disrupt the shadow's sensory organs. It had worked, but not as well as they'd hoped. "They're adapting faster than we anticipated," Dr. Chen said, her voice tight with worry. This one showed signs of increased resistance to our countermeasures. Gideon paced the room, his face etched with concern. "We need to change our approach. We can't just react to their incursions anymore. We need to take the fight to them. The room erupted into argument. Some, like Tom, agreed with Gideon. Others, including Dr. Chen, argued for a more cautious approach, warning that escalating the conflict could lead to disastrous consequences. As the debate raged on, I found myself thinking about the shadow's eyes, the intelligence I'd seen there, the almost human-like quality of its gaze. There was something we were missing, some crucial piece of the puzzle. "What if we're looking at this all wrong?" I said, my voice cutting through the argument. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. We've been treating the shadows like animals, like some kind of invasive species. But what if they're more than that? What if they're trying to communicate? Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "Go on." "The markings on that tree Gideon showed me, the way this shadow moved and acted. It was all too deliberate. What if this isn't just about reclaiming territory? What if they're trying to tell us something?" The room was quiet as everyone considered my words. Finally, Gideon spoke up. "It's an interesting theory, kid, but how do we test it? How do we communicate with something that's been trying to kill us?" I didn't have an answer, but I could feel we were on the cusp of something important. The encounter in town had shaken me, but it had also opened my eyes to a new possibility. The shadows weren't just mindless beasts. They were intelligent, purposeful. And if we could understand their purpose, maybe we could find a way to coexist. As the discussion continued late into the night, I found myself looking out the window at the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there, the shadows were watching, waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that our next encounter would change everything. The war had begun, but it wasn't the war we thought we were fighting. It was a war of understanding, of bridging the gap between two intelligent species that had shared the earth for millennia without truly seeing each other. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were filled with visions of ancient forests and shadowy figures, of a world where humans and shadows walked side by side. Whether that future was possible or just a naive fantasy, I didn't know, but I was determined to find out. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin windows, I awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the previous night had solidified my resolve to find a way to communicate with the shadows. I found Gideon and Dr. Chen already up, poring over maps and data sheets. They looked up as I approached, their faces showing a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Dr. Chen began, "about the shadows trying to communicate. It's a long shot, but I think you might be onto something." Gideon nodded, his expression grave. "We've been so focused on defending ourselves that we never stopped to consider other possibilities. If there's even a chance of communication, we need to explore it." Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into this new approach. Dr. Chen worked tirelessly to analyze the shadow's vocalizations and body language, looking for patterns that might indicate language. I spent hours with Gideon, revisiting the site of the ancient tree, studying the markings for any clues they might hold. Our breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a routine patrol, we encountered a young shadow, smaller than the others we'd seen. Instead of attacking, it seemed curious, mirroring our movements and vocalizing in a way that seemed almost conversational. Using Dr. Chen's research, we attempted to communicate. It was slow, frustrating work, full of misunderstandings and near disasters, but gradually we began to make progress. We learned that the shadows weren't trying to reclaim the world. They were trying to save it. They had sensed the damage being done to the environment long before we had, and their increased activity was an attempt to restore balance. The attacks on humans were a last resort, born of frustration and fear. As we shared this information with the wider world, reactions were mixed. Many refused to believe, clinging to the idea of the shadows as mindless monsters. Others saw the potential for a new era of cooperation and understanding. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of violence and misunderstanding on both sides. But slowly, painfully, we began to build bridges. A year after my fateful hike, I stood at the edge of a clearing, watching as a group of scientists worked alongside shadows, combining our technology with their innate understanding of the natural world to heal the damage we'd done to the planet. Gideon stood beside me, his weathered face showing a hint of a smile. "You did good, kid," he said, his gruff voice tinged with pride. "You saw what the rest of us couldn't." I shook my head. We all did this, together. As I looked out at the scene before me, humans and shadows working side by side, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't experienced since that first terrifying encounter in the woods. The world had changed, and so had I. The monsters in the dark had turned out to be potential allies, and the true enemy was our own ignorance and fear. There was still much work to be done, many challenges to overcome. But for the first time, I felt truly optimistic about the future. A future where humans and shadows could coexist, learning from each other and working together to protect the world we shared. As the sun set on another day of this new era, I couldn't help but think back to that scared, naive hiker I'd been just a year ago. I never could have imagined where that trail would lead me, but standing here now, I wouldn't have it any other way. The end of one journey had led to the beginning of something far greater. And whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together. Humans and shadows, united in our quest to understand and protect the world around us. The crackling of the campfire filled the crisp mountain air as I settled into my camping chair, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. It was July 15th, 2024, and I, Liam Hartley, a 32-year-old software engineer from bustling Seattle, had embarked on a solo camping trip in the vast expanse of Olympic National Forest. The decision to venture into the wilderness alone wasn't made lightly. Months of grueling deadlines and the constant hum of city life had left me yearning for silence and solitude. I craved a reset, a chance to reconnect with nature and myself. Little did I know that this desire for isolation would lead me down a path I never anticipated. As I gazed into the fire, I reflected on the journey that brought me here. The winding forest road that seemed to stretch endlessly, the weight of my backpack as I hiked deeper into the woods, and the sense of accomplishment as I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The forest around me was alive with sounds, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of an owl, the soft bubbling of a nearby stream. It was a stark contrast to the constant sirens and chatter of the city. Here, every sound felt significant, every shadow held depth. I breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of pine and damp earth. The aroma of my dinner, a simple meal of rehydrated camping food, lingered in the air. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chuckled to myself, attributing the sensation to my urban instincts adjusting to the vastness of nature. As night fell, the forest transformed. The friendly green canopy above turned into a looming darkness. Shadows danced at the edge of my campfire's light, creating shifting patterns that played tricks on my eyes. I found myself straining to identify shapes in the darkness, my imagination conjuring images that I knew couldn't be real. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing unease. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? To be alone with my thoughts, away from the distractions of modern life. Yet, as the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel that the silence I had so eagerly sought was now pressing in on me, heavy and expectant. Deciding to turn in for the night, I doused the fire and retreated to my tent. The sudden darkness was overwhelming. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam seeming feeble against the encompassing blackness. As I zipped up the tent, I realized how thin the fabric barrier was between me and the vast unknown forest. Sleep came fitfully. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf jolted me awake. In the depths of the night, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A long, low howl that seemed to reverberate through the trees. Wolf, coyote. My mind raced, calculating the likelihood of dangerous wildlife in the area. I had researched thoroughly before the trip, knew the statistics, the safety precautions. Yet in that moment, rational thought seemed distant and unreliable. As dawn broke, I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. The forest, bathed in the soft morning light, seemed to mock my night terrors. Birds chirped cheerfully, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. I forced a laugh, chiding myself for letting my imagination run wild. I set about making breakfast, the routine tasks helping to ground me. As I waited for my coffee to brew, I pulled out my map, planning the day's hike. I had chosen a trail that would lead me deeper into the forest, to a secluded lake I'd read about online. The prospect of crystal clear waters surrounded by untouched wilderness had been enticing when I planned the trip. Now I felt a flicker of apprehension at the idea of venturing further from civilization. Pushing aside my doubts, I packed up camp and set out. The trail was well marked but rugged, winding through dense undergrowth and overexposed roots. As I hiked, the events of the night began to feel distant, silly even. The forest in daylight was beautiful, alive with color and movement. I stopped often to photograph interesting plants or catch glimpses of wildlife. A curious squirrel, a fleeting deer. Yet as the day wore on and the trail led me deeper into the heart of the forest, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The trees seemed to press closer, the underbrush thicker. I found myself checking and rechecking my map and compass, a nagging fear of getting lost taking root in my mind. It was mid-afternoon when I realized I hadn't seen another human being all day. No distant voices of fellow hikers, no signs of recent passage on the trail. The solitude I had craved now felt oppressive. I tried to rationalize. This was a remote area. It was natural not to encounter others. But a primal part of my brain screamed that this wasn't right, that I had ventured too far from safety. As I pushed through a particularly dense section of undergrowth, my foot caught on a hidden root. I stumbled, my heavy pack throwing me off balance. I fell hard, tumbling down a small incline. Pain shot through my ankle as I came to a stop, leaves and twigs clinging to my clothes. Cursing, I sat up and assessed the damage. My ankle was already swelling, a fierce throbbing setting in. I reached for my first aid kit, binding the injury as best I could. But as I sat there, surrounded by the indifferent forest, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was alone, injured, in a remote part of a vast wilderness. Night would be falling in a few hours, and I was nowhere near my planned campsite. The confidence I had felt at the start of this adventure evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. As I struggled to my feet, testing my weight on the injured ankle, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding. The dense foliage revealed nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and I was in no condition to outrun it. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, shadows lengthening around me. I knew I had to make a decision, push on to find a safe campsite, or hunker down where I was. Either choice felt fraught with danger. As I stood there, indecision paralyzing me, I realized that the true horror of my situation was just beginning to unfold. The fading daylight cast long shadows through the trees as I limped forward, each step sending a jolt of pain through my ankle. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just hours ago, now felt like a closing trap. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant cry of a bird, set my nerves on edge. I pushed on, driven by the desperate need to find a suitable campsite before darkness fell completely. My injured ankle made progress frustratingly slow, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. As twilight deepened, I finally stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't ideal. The ground was uneven and strewn with fallen branches, but it would have to do. With shaking hands, I began to set up my tent, a task made difficult by the growing darkness and my increasingly panicked state. Just as I was securing the last tent peg, a sound froze me in place. It was a low, guttural growl, barely audible but unmistakably close. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned, scanning the tree line. In the dim light, I could make out nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Holding my breath, I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Had I imagined it? Was my fear playing tricks on my mind? I wanted to believe that, but the hairs standing up on the back of my neck told a different story. With fumbling haste, I finished setting up camp, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I debated whether to risk a fire. On one hand, it could attract unwanted attention, from wildlife or worse. On the other, it offered light, warmth, and a semblance of safety. In the end, the primal fear of darkness won out. As I coaxed the flames to life, my mind raced. I thought of my comfortable apartment back in Seattle, of my colleagues who would be expecting me back at work in a few days. Would they notice if I didn't show up? How long before someone realized I was missing? The fire cast flickering shadows around the clearing, creating an illusion of movement at the edge of my vision. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there, yet the feeling of being observed intensified. I found myself speaking out loud, trying to fill the oppressive silence with the sound of my own voice. "It's okay, Liam. You're just letting your imagination run wild. There's nothing out there that wasn't there this morning." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Something had changed. The forest felt different, malevolent almost. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just the injury and the stress playing havoc with my mind. But deep down, a primal part of me knew better. As the night wore on, my senses seemed to heighten. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through my body. I found myself straining to identify shapes in the darkness beyond the firelight, my imagination populating the shadows with lurking predators. Sleep was out of the question. I sat with my back to the fire, facing the darkness, my camping knife clutched in my hand. It felt pitifully inadequate against the unnamed threats my mind conjured, but its solid weight offered a small comfort. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It whispered through the trees, carrying with it sounds that made my skin crawl. At times it seemed to form words, unintelligible murmurs that danced at the edge of comprehension. I told myself it was just the wind, just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but the doubt gnawed at me. As the wind grew stronger, the flames of my fire danced wildly, causing the shadows to leap and twist in a frenzied ballet. And then, for a split second, I saw it. A shape, darker than the surrounding night, moving between the trees. It was there and gone so quickly that I couldn't be sure of what I'd seen. But it was enough to send my heart racing, my palms sweating as I gripped the knife tighter. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and frightened in the vast darkness. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered, its mournful howl seeming to mock my fear. I stood up, wincing as I put weight on my injured ankle and peered into the night. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and undergrowth but revealing nothing unusual. As I swept the light back and forth, a glint caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, something reflective. I limped closer, curiosity momentarily overriding fear. As I approached, my breath caught in my throat. There, hanging from a low branch, was a small mirror. Its surface was dirty and cracked, but in its reflection, I could clearly see my own terrified face. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The mirror hadn't been there earlier, I was certain of it. Someone, or something, had placed it there while I was distracted by the fire. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was not alone in this forest, and whatever was out there, it was toying with me. As if to confirm my fears, a laugh echoed through the trees, a sound so filled with malice that it chilled me to my very core. In that moment, I knew that the horror I had experienced so far was only the beginning. Whatever sinister force inhabited these woods, it had noticed me, and it was just getting started. The night seemed endless, each hour stretching into an eternity of hypervigilance and mounting dread. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my injured ankle throbbed relentlessly. As the forest awakened around me, I struggled to make sense of the night's events. In the soft morning light, the mirror still hung from the branch where I'd found it, a silent reminder that my terrifying experiences had been real. I approached it cautiously, half expecting something to leap out at me. But there was only my own haggard reflection staring back, eyes wide and bloodshot, stubble darkening my jaw. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the mirror's surface. It was cold and undeniably solid. This was no hallucination. Someone had been in my camp, close enough to hang this mirror without me noticing. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Turning away from the mirror, I surveyed my campsite. Everything appeared untouched, exactly as I had left it. Yet the feeling of wrongness persisted, an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I needed to get out of these woods. My original plan of a week-long solitary retreat now seemed like madness. I had to find my way back to civilization, to safety. But as I began to pack up my camp, a horrifying realization struck me. I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Panic rising in my throat, I fumbled for my map and compass, but as I unfolded the map, my blood ran cold. The familiar trails and landmarks were gone, replaced by an intricate maze of lines that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, but the bizarre map remained unchanged. "This isn't possible," I muttered, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I reached for my phone, desperate for its GPS, only to find the screen cracked and unresponsive. When had that happened? I couldn't remember. With growing desperation, I shoved everything into my backpack, wincing as I shouldered the weight. I had to move, had to find my way out. Picking a direction that felt right, I began to walk, my injured ankle protesting with every step. The forest seemed different in the daylight, yet no less menacing. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once I found myself ducking to avoid their grasp, only to feel foolish moments later. Was I losing my mind? As I pushed on, the terrain became increasingly difficult. The underbrush grew thicker, thorny vines catching at my clothes and scratching my skin. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. My water supply dwindled rapidly in the humid air, and hunger gnawed at my stomach. Yet I pressed on, driven by the desperate need to escape this nightmare. It was mid-afternoon when I heard it, a sound that made me stop in my tracks. Voices, distant but unmistakable. Human voices. Relief flooded through me, and I changed direction, moving as quickly as my injured ankle would allow toward the sound. As I got closer, I could make out words, fragments of conversation. They sounded cheerful, normal, the casual chatter of hikers enjoying a day in the woods. I wanted to call out, to run toward them, but something held me back. A nagging sense of caution that I couldn't explain. I crept forward quietly, pushing aside branches to peer into a small clearing. What I saw there drained the blood from my face and sent me stumbling backward in horror. There, in the clearing, stood perfect replicas of myself. 3 of them, laughing and talking, dressed in the same clothes I wore, with the same backpack I carried. Every detail was identical, down to the bandage on my ankle. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, one of the doppelgangers turned and looked directly at me, its eyes empty and black as pitch. A scream built in my throat, but before I could release it, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. I thrashed wildly, terror giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. But my unseen assailant was stronger, dragging me backward into the dense undergrowth. "Quiet," a voice hissed in my ear, "unless you want them to hear you." The voice was my own. I went limp with shock, my mind unable to process what was happening. The hand over my mouth loosened slightly, and I was turned around to face my captor. I found myself staring into my own face, but this version of me looked haggard, wild-eyed, clothes torn and dirty as if he'd been in the woods for weeks. What are you?" I managed to choke out. My doppelganger's face twisted into a grim smile. "I'm you," he said. "Or rather, I'm what's left of you after the forest is done with you." I shook my head, trying to deny the impossible reality before me. "This isn't real," I muttered. "It can't be real." "Oh, it's real," my other self said, his voice filled with a mixture of pity and grim amusement. "More real than you can imagine. And if you want to survive, you need to listen to me very carefully." As he spoke, a chorus of my own screams echoed through the forest, coming from the direction of the clearing. The sound chilled me to my core, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that my ordeal was far from over. Whatever malevolent force ruled these woods, it wasn't done with me yet. And my only guide through this nightmare was a version of myself I wasn't sure I could trust. The forest around us seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I realized that my grasp on reality was slipping away with each passing moment. What had started as a simple camping trip had become a descent into a waking nightmare, one from which I feared I might never escape. My doppelganger pulled me deeper into the undergrowth, away from the clearing where the other versions of myself still laughed and talked. The sound of their voices, so familiar yet so wrong, faded as we moved swiftly through the forest. "We don't have much time," my other self said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll realize you've seen them soon, and then the real hunt begins." I stumbled along beside him, my mind reeling. Who are they? What's happening to me? He stopped abruptly, turning to face me. In the dappled light filtering through the canopy, I could see the lines of exhaustion etched deeply into his face. My face. "They're echoes," he said. "Fragments of yourself left behind each time you've looped through this nightmare. But they're not you anymore. They belong to the forest now." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. "Looped? What do you mean?" "You've been here before, Liam, many times. Each time you enter the forest, thinking it's your first trip. Each time you get lost, get hurt, and encounter the horrors waiting in the shadows. And each time a piece of you gets left behind." A chill ran down my spine as fragmented memories began to surface. Flashes of terror, pain, and despair that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. How many times? My doppelganger's eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and grim determination. "I've lost count, but I'm what's left of your last attempt to break the cycle, and I'm here to make sure that this time we get out." Before I could respond, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. It was my voice again, filled with agony and terror. My doppelganger grabbed my arm. "We have to move. Now!" We ran through the forest, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. My injured ankle screamed in protest, but adrenaline and fear pushed me forward. Behind us, I could hear crashing sounds, as if something large was moving through the undergrowth in pursuit. "What's chasing us?" I gasped as we ran. "The forest itself," my other self replied grimly, "or whatever entity controls it. It feeds on fear, on suffering, and it's not about to let its favorite prey escape." We burst into a small clearing, and I stumbled to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the clearing stood a lone figure, another version of myself. But this one was different. Its skin was pale and waxy, its eyes sunken and empty. As it turned to face us, I saw that its chest was a gaping wound, ribs protruding from torn flesh. "Don't look at it," my doppelganger hissed, pulling me away. "It's not real. Not anymore." But as we turned to leave the clearing, we found our path blocked. More versions of myself emerged from the trees, some bloodied, some emaciated, all wearing expressions of mingled hunger and despair. They began to close in around us, their movements jerky and unnatural. "This is new," my doppelganger muttered, his eyes darting around for an escape route. I felt the last shreds of my sanity beginning to slip away. "What do we do?" He turned to me, his expression fierce. "We fight. We've never fought before. Always ran, always hid. Maybe that's why we keep losing. This time we stand our ground." As if in response to his words, the air around us seemed to thicken, the very atmosphere becoming oppressive. The sky darkened, though it was still mid-afternoon. The other versions of myself began to moan, a chilling chorus of my own voice distorted by pain and madness. My doppelganger reached into his pack and pulled out a flare gun. "I've been saving this," he said, his voice tight. "Never had the courage to use it before, but now." He raised the gun and fired. The flare shot upward, briefly illuminating the clearing with harsh red light. For a moment the advancing figures hesitated, shrinking back from the sudden brightness. But then the forest seemed to react. The trees around the clearing began to groan, their branches writhing like tentacles. The ground beneath our feet trembled and shifted, and from somewhere deep in the woods a roar sounded, a noise so primal and filled with rage that it shook me to my core. "What have we done?" I whispered, terror clawing at my throat. My doppelganger's face was a mask of determination. "We've challenged it. For the first time, we're not just running, we're fighting back." As the words left his mouth, the clearing erupted into chaos. The ground split open, roots bursting forth like grasping hands. The other versions of myself surged forward, their moans rising to screams, and through it all that terrible roar grew louder, closer. I felt something snap inside me. Fear gave way to a rage I'd never known I possessed. If this forest, this entity, whatever it was, wanted to trap me here, to feed on my fear for eternity, then I would make it regret that choice. I grabbed a fallen branch, hefting it like a club. Beside me, my doppelganger did the same. As our twisted reflections closed in around us, as the forest itself seemed to come alive with malevolent purpose, we stood back to back, ready to fight. In that moment, I knew that everything had changed. This was no longer about survival, about escaping. This was war, and I was determined that this time, somehow, I would win. The chaos in the clearing reached a fever pitch. The twisted versions of myself lunged forward, their hands grasping, mouths open in silent screams. I swung my makeshift club wildly, feeling it connect with something solid. One of my doppelgangers stumbled back, its face caved in, but it kept coming. "They don't feel pain," I shouted to my ally, the version of myself who had been guiding me. "They're not real," he yelled back, fending off another attacker. "Not anymore, they're just echoes, puppets of the forest." As we fought, the very ground beneath our feet seemed to come alive. Roots erupted from the earth, wrapping around our ankles, trying to drag us down. The trees around the clearing swayed and groaned, their branches reaching for us like gnarled fingers. I lost track of time as we battled. My muscles burned, my injured ankle a constant source of agony, but I pushed through the pain. For every twisted version of myself that we knocked down, two more seemed to take its place. They pressed in from all sides, an army of my own face distorted by suffering and madness. Just when it seemed we would be overwhelmed, a sound cut through the chaos, a long low horn blast that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Everything froze for a moment. The attacking figures paused, their heads cocked as if listening. Even the writhing roots stilled. "What was that?" I gasped, using the brief respite to catch my breath. My doppelganger's eyes were wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "I don't know. In all the times we've been through this, I've never heard that before." The horn sounded again, closer this time. And with it came a new sound, the rhythmic thudding of something large moving through the forest, heading straight for our clearing. The twisted reflections of myself began to retreat, melting back into the shadows of the trees. The roots that had been trying to ensnare us sank back into the earth. For a moment, an eerie calm settled over the clearing, and then it arrived. The trees at the edge of the clearing parted, and a massive figure stepped into view. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. It was as if the forest itself had taken form, a towering humanoid shape composed of twisted branches, moss, and leaves. Its face was a hollow in the trunk, two glowing points of light serving as eyes. "What is that thing?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I think," my doppelganger replied slowly, "it's the heart of the forest, the entity that's been trapping us here." The creature, if it could be called that, regarded us silently for a long moment. Then it spoke, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You resist," it said, "all these cycles, and finally you resist." I found my voice, anger overriding my fear. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The forest entity tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. "Want? I want what all living things want, to survive, to grow. And you, Liam Hartley, you feed me so well." "Feed you?" my doppelganger asked, his voice filled with horror. "Our fear? Our suffering?" "Your emotions," the entity corrected. "Your experiences. Each time you cycle through, you leave behind a piece of yourself, rich with memory, with feeling. I absorb these fragments and I grow." The realization hit me like a physical blow. All those twisted versions of myself, they weren't just echoes. They were pieces of my soul, consumed by this monstrous being. "No more," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I won't be your food source anymore. This ends now." The entity's glowing eyes seemed to flare brighter. "You cannot end this, little mortal. You are mine. You have always been mine, and you will cycle through my realm until there is nothing left of you to take." As it spoke, the clearing began to shift and change. The trees blurred, reality itself seeming to warp around us. I felt a familiar sensation of vertigo, of time slipping away. With a jolt of horror, I realized what was happening. The cycle was starting over. "No!" I shouted, reaching out to grab my doppelganger's arm. "I won't forget again. I won't let you reset me." My other self looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Then don't," he said, and with that he shoved me hard, sending me stumbling backward. As I fell, the world seemed to fracture around me. I saw my doppelganger turn to face the forest entity, his stance defiant. I saw the twisted versions of myself emerging once again from the shadows, and I saw the entity reach out with a massive hand of tangled branches. Then everything went black. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. I was in my tent, early morning light filtering through the fabric. For a moment, confusion reigned. Had it all been a dream? But as I sat up, pain lanced through my ankle. I looked down to see it swollen and bruised, and there, clutched in my hand, was a small cracked mirror. The memories came flooding back, along with a bone-deep certainty. This was no dream. This was real. And somehow, against all odds, I had retained my memories of what had happened. As I unzipped my tent and looked out at the seemingly peaceful forest around me, I knew that my true ordeal was just beginning. The entity that controlled this place wouldn't let me go easily. But this time I was aware. This time I would fight. And this time I swore to myself I would find a way to break the cycle once and for all. With trembling hands, I packed up my campsite, every rustle in the underbrush making me flinch. The peaceful morning felt like a thin veneer, barely concealing the malevolence I now knew lurked in these woods. As I shouldered my backpack, wincing at the weight on my injured ankle, I tried to formulate a plan. I knew I couldn't simply walk out of the forest. Countless cycles had proven that futile. The entity controlling this place wouldn't let me escape so easily. No, I needed to find a way to confront it, to break its hold over me, and this twisted version of reality it had created. But how does one fight a forest? As I set off, choosing a direction that felt right, or at least less wrong, I found myself hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every tree seemed to loom ominously, every shadow potentially hiding one of those nightmarish versions of myself. The weight of the small mirror in my pocket was a constant reminder that this was no ordinary hike. Hours passed as I pushed through the dense undergrowth. My injured ankle throbbed relentlessly, and hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I pressed on. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped, if I let my guard down for even a moment, I would lose this tenuous grasp on reality and find myself back at the beginning of the cycle. It was mid-afternoon when I stumbled upon something that made me stop short. There, in a small clearing, stood a cabin. It looked old, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss, but it was undeniably man-made. In all my remembered cycles through this forest, I had never encountered anything like this. Approaching cautiously, I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" No response came, but as I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, and carved into its surface was a symbol, a spiral surrounded by what looked like stylized tree branches. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the musty smell of abandonment. But what caught my attention were the walls. Every inch of space was covered in writing, scrawled notes, complex diagrams, and more of those strange spiral symbols. As I moved closer to examine them, my blood ran cold. The handwriting was my own. Fragments of the notes jumped out at me. The forest feeds on fear. Time is not linear here. The entity can be wounded, but how to kill it? My head spun as I tried to process what I was seeing. Had I written these notes in a previous cycle, or was this some new trick of the forest, designed to confuse and terrify me? As I moved deeper into the cabin, something on a rickety table caught my eye. It was a journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. With shaking hands, I opened it, recognizing my own handwriting once again. I don't know how many cycles it's been, hundreds, thousands, I've lost count. But this time is different. I remember, and I found a way to leave messages for myself. If you're reading this, then you remember too, and that means we have a chance. The entity that controls this forest, it's not invincible. It can be hurt. The flare gun proved that, but to truly defeat it, we need to strike at its heart. There's a place deep in the forest where reality is thinnest, where the entity is most vulnerable. I've marked it on the map. Be careful. The closer you get, the more desperate the entity will become. It will throw everything it has at you. But remember, this is our chance to end this nightmare once and for all. Good luck. And if you fail, I'll see you in the next cycle." Attached to the last page was a crudely drawn map, showing a winding path through the forest to a location marked with the same spiral symbol I'd seen on the door. As I stared at the map, trying to memorize its details, a sound from outside made me freeze. Footsteps drawing closer to the cabin, and then a voice, my voice, calling out, "I know you're in there. Come out, wherever you are." My heart pounded as I realized the entity had found me. The brief respite was over. Now the real battle was about to begin. I tucked the journal into my backpack and moved to the cabin's rear window. As I eased it open, preparing to slip out, I caught a glimpse of my pursuer. It was another version of myself, but twisted, wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and its eyes were pitch black, reflecting no light. Taking a deep breath, I slipped out of the window and into the dense undergrowth behind the cabin. The map in the journal had given me a destination, a purpose. Now I just had to reach it, evading or confronting whatever horrors the forest threw in my path. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching for me like grasping hands. The entity knew I was a threat now, and it wouldn't hold back. The true test was just beginning. The forest grew denser as I followed the crude map, the canopy above blocking out more and more sunlight. The air became thick and oppressive, filled with an unnatural mist that seemed to cling to my skin. Every step was a struggle, not just because of my injured ankle, but because the very ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and pull, as if trying to slow my progress. I lost track of time as I pushed forward, the monotony of the forest broken only by occasional glimpses of my twisted doppelgangers in the distance. They never approached directly, instead flitting between trees at the edge of my vision, their presence a constant reminder of the danger I was in. As night fell, the forest came alive with eerie sounds, whispers that seemed to form words just beyond my comprehension, and skittering noises that always seemed to be right behind me. I didn't dare stop to rest, knowing that to do so might mean losing this fragile grasp on reality. It was near dawn when I finally reached the location marked on the map. The trees here were different, ancient giants with gnarled trunks and branches that formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead. At the center of this grove stood a massive oak, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter. Carved into its bark was the now familiar spiral symbol, glowing faintly with an inner light. As I approached the tree, the air around me seemed to thicken, reality itself wavering like a mirage in the desert. I reached out to touch the carved symbol, and as my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy surged through me. Visions flashed before my eyes, hundreds, thousands of cycles through the forest, each ending in terror and despair. I saw myself broken, devoured, absorbed by the entity countless times. But I also saw hope, faint glimpses of resistance, of small victories against the forest's will. And with each of these moments, I felt the entity's grip weaken ever so slightly. A deep, rumbling voice broke through my trance. "You should not have come here, little mortal." I spun around to find the forest entity looming over me, its form even more massive and terrifying than before. Roots and vines writhed around it like tentacles, and its eyes blazed with an otherworldly light. "This ends now," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I won't be your puppet anymore." The entity's laughter shook the ground beneath my feet. "You think you can challenge me? Here at the heart of my power. You are nothing but food, a fleeting spark to sustain my eternal hunger." As it spoke, the grove came alive with motion. My twisted reflections emerged from the shadows by the dozens, surrounding me in a tightening circle. The ground itself seemed to undulate, roots bursting forth to try and entangle my feet. I closed my eyes, centering myself. All the fear, all the pain I had experienced through countless cycles, I let it flow through me, fueling my determination. When I opened my eyes again, I met the entity's gaze unflinchingly. "I am not your food," I declared. "I am not your puppet. I am Liam Hartley, and I choose to be free." With those words, I reached into my backpack and pulled out the flare gun I had found in the cabin. The entity's eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time I saw fear in its alien features. "No!" it roared, lunging forward. But I was faster. I aimed at the carved symbol on the ancient oak and fired. The flare struck true, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then everything exploded into chaos. The symbol erupted in blinding light, and a shockwave of energy pulsed outward. The twisted versions of myself screamed and dissolved into mist. The entity howled, its form wavering and distorting as if being torn apart from the inside. I felt a tugging sensation, as if my very being was being pulled in 1,000 directions at once. Memories flooded through me, not just of the cycles I had endured, but of the real world beyond this nightmare forest. I saw my life in Seattle, my friends, my family, all the experiences that made me who I was. The entity's voice boomed in my mind, filled with rage and desperation. "You cannot escape me. You are mine." But with each passing second, its voice grew weaker, more distant. I focused on the memories of my real life, using them as an anchor against the maelstrom of energy tearing at the fabric of this false reality. "I am Liam Hartley," I repeated, each word a declaration of defiance. "And I am free." With a final, earth-shattering roar, the entity's form collapsed in on itself. The forest around me began to fade, the trees becoming translucent, then disappearing altogether. The ground beneath my feet dissolved into nothingness. For a moment I was suspended in a void of swirling energy and fragmenting reality. Then darkness took me. I awoke with a gasp, my heart pounding. I was lying in my tent, morning sunlight filtering through the fabric. For a long moment I lay there, afraid to move, afraid that this was just another cruel trick of the forest. But as I sat up, I realized something was different. The oppressive presence I had felt for so long was gone. The air felt clean, normal. And when I unzipped the tent and looked out, I saw not the nightmare forest, but the familiar campsite where I had started my journey. As the realization sank in, I began to laugh, tears streaming down my face. It was over. I was free. But even as relief washed over me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a chilling question. Was it truly over? Or was this just the beginning of a new, more insidious cycle? The journey back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and lingering fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, but nothing sinister materialized. By the time I reached the ranger station at the edge of Olympic National Forest, I was barely standing, my injured ankle swollen to twice its normal size. The rangers were alarmed by my appearance, dirty, injured, and wild-eyed. They called for medical assistance and contacted my emergency contacts. As I waited for help to arrive, I found myself struggling to explain what had happened. How could I describe the nightmare I had endured without sounding completely insane? In the end, I settled for a simplified version of events. I had gotten lost, injured my ankle, and spent several terrifying days trying to find my way back. The rangers nodded sympathetically, attributing my more outlandish statements to dehydration and trauma. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of medical checkups, debriefings with park officials, and concerned visits from friends and family. I was diagnosed with a severe sprain and put on crutches. The doctors also noted signs of extreme stress and recommended therapy to help deal with the trauma of my ordeal. But as life slowly returned to normal, I found myself plagued by doubts. Had it all been real? Or was it, as the doctors gently suggested, a hallucination brought on by injury and isolation? The journal I remembered finding in the cabin was nowhere to be found in my belongings. The mirror was just a broken compact in my first aid kit, and my internet searches for similar experiences in Olympic National Forest turned up nothing out of the ordinary. Weeks turned into months. I returned to work, my ankle healed, and the nightmares that had initially plagued me began to fade. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I found myself hyper-aware of the natural world around me, flinching at the sight of dense forests or tangled roots breaking through concrete. It was a crisp autumn day, nearly 6 months after my camping trip, when I finally found the courage to return to Olympic National Forest. I didn't venture deep into the woods, instead sticking to a popular, well-maintained trail near the visitor center. As I walked, I found myself searching for signs of the nightmare I had experienced: twisted trees, unnatural shadows, my own face staring back at me from the undergrowth. But there was nothing. Just a beautiful, peaceful forest, alive with the sounds of birds and small animals going about their day. As I stood there, breathing in the clean, pine-scented air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Whatever had happened, hallucination or supernatural encounter, it was over. I turned to head back to my car, finally ready to put the experience behind me. And that's when I saw it. There, carved into the trunk of an old Douglas fir, was a familiar spiral symbol. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it, my hand reaching out almost of its own accord. Just before my fingers made contact with the bark, I stopped myself. Did I really want to know? Did I want to risk awakening whatever had tormented me if indeed it had been real? After a long moment, I lowered my hand and stepped back. Some questions, I decided, were better left unanswered. Whatever the truth of my experience, I had survived. I had found my way back to my life, my sanity intact. Perhaps that was victory enough. As I walked back to the parking lot, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The forest around me was just a forest, beautiful, sometimes dangerous, but ultimately a natural part of the world. And I was just a man, shaped by my experiences, but not defined by them. I reached my car and paused, looking back at the trees. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a familiar face peering out from behind a trunk. But when I blinked, it was gone. With a small smile, I got into my car and started the engine. As I drove away from Olympic National Forest for what I knew would be the last time, I felt truly free. The nightmare was over, whether it had been real or imagined, and I was ready to embrace whatever new adventures life had in store for me. But as I merged onto the highway, heading back to Seattle, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The forest receded into the distance, a dark line on the horizon. And just for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a towering figure among the trees, its body made of twisted branches, watching me go. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself, just the last remnant of a fading nightmare. I turned my eyes to the road ahead, to the future, and didn't look back again. The open road stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. My loyal companion, a scruffy mutt with soulful eyes, sat contentedly in the passenger seat, his head hanging out the window as we cruised along. We were on a cross-country adventure, just the two of us, with Yellowstone National Park as our next destination. As we approached the park, my excitement grew. I had heard so much about its natural wonders, the geysers, hot springs, and diverse wildlife. The plan was simple. Find a campsite, set up for the night, and spend the next few days exploring this magnificent wilderness. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon when we finally reached the park entrance. After paying the entry fee and receiving a map from the ranger, I drove towards the first campground on my list. To my dismay, a large "full" sign greeted me at the entrance. No problem, I thought. There are plenty of other campgrounds in the park. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a long and frustrating search. As I drove from one campground to another, the story remained the same. Every single site was occupied. The park was teeming with visitors, all eager to experience the beauty of Yellowstone during the peak season. I circled the park's main loop road multiple times, hoping that someone might have left early or that a last-minute cancellation would open up a spot. With each passing minute, the sun sank lower, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, I would have marveled at the breathtaking sunset, but my growing concern about finding a place to sleep overshadowed its beauty. As darkness settled over the park, I realized I had to make a decision. The idea of sleeping in my car in a parking lot didn't appeal to me, especially with my furry friend in tow. That's when I remembered passing a secluded trailhead earlier. It wasn't an official campsite, but it seemed like the best option given the circumstances. With a mix of trepidation and determination, I steered my vehicle back to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, which was both a relief and slightly unnerving. I quickly gathered my gear, strapping my frame pack to my back and ensuring I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few basic tools. My dog seemed to sense the change in plans, wagging his tail excitedly as we set off down the trail. The path was barely visible in the fading light, but I had a good flashlight to guide our way. We hiked for about 15 minutes, moving deeper into the wilderness, before I decided we had gone far enough to avoid detection. Veering off the trail, we made our way to the edge of a small clearing. It was a picturesque spot, with a grassy meadow surrounded by towering pines. In the distance I could make out the silhouette of mountains against the star-studded sky. Despite the unplanned nature of our campsite, I couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure and connection with nature. Knowing the importance of minimizing our impact on the environment, I carefully selected a spot for our camp. I chose a flat area with minimal vegetation, hoping to leave as little trace as possible of our presence. My first task was to dig a small fire pit. Using a collapsible shovel from my pack, I scraped away the top layer of soil and created a circular depression. Next came the tent. I had practiced setting it up in my backyard before the trip, and that practice paid off now as I efficiently assembled our shelter for the night. My dog watched curiously, occasionally sniffing around the perimeter of our makeshift campsite. With the tent up, I turned my attention to dinner. I had packed some hot dogs, thinking they'd be an easy meal to cook over a campfire. As I gathered some small branches and kindling for the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruders in this wild place. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me pause and look around, half expecting to see a park ranger or a wild animal emerging from the darkness. Once the fire was going, I roasted the hot dogs on long sticks. My canine companion sat patiently, his eyes fixed on the sizzling meat. The aroma of cooking food filled the air, and I hoped it wouldn't attract any unwanted visitors. We shared our simple meal, the hot dogs tasting better than any gourmet dish in that moment of hunger and exhaustion. After dinner, I meticulously cleaned up our site. I knew the importance of proper food storage in bear country, so I gathered all our leftovers and trash into a bag. Using some rope from my pack, I hung the bag high in a nearby tree, well away from our tent. It was a bit of a struggle in the dark, but I knew it was crucial for our safety. With everything secured, I extinguished the fire, making sure to douse it thoroughly with water from my canteen. I scattered the wet ashes and covered the fire pit with the soil I had initially removed, trying to erase any evidence of our presence. Exhausted from the long day of driving and the unexpected hike, I crawled into the tent with my dog. The lightweight sleeping bag provided welcome warmth against the cool night air. As I lay there, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement at the adventure, a twinge of guilt for camping in an unauthorized area, and a hint of apprehension about what the night might bring. Sleep came quickly, but it was destined to be a night of interruptions. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when the first howl pierced the night. At first it sounded distant, maybe a few miles away. In my groggy state, I marveled at the haunting beauty of the sound. It was a reminder that we were in true wilderness, sharing the land with its wild inhabitants. As I started to drift back to sleep, another howl rang out, this time noticeably closer. My dog, who had been sleeping soundly at my feet, raised his head, ears perked in alert curiosity. I patted him reassuringly, trying to convey a calmness I didn't entirely feel. The howls continued, each time seeming to come from a different direction and growing ever closer. It was hard to judge distance in the dark, unfamiliar terrain, but I estimated that the wolves were now at the edge of the meadow where we were camped. My mind raced, trying to recall everything I knew about wolf behavior. I knew attacks on humans were extremely rare, but that did little to calm my racing heart. Soon, the sounds of padding feet and sniffing noses circled our tent. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My dog, to his credit, remained silent, though I could feel him trembling slightly against my leg. The wolves seemed curious, investigating this strange new object in their territory. Those minutes felt like hours as we waited, hoping the wolves would lose interest and move on. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the sounds began to recede. A distant howl signaled that the pack was moving away, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion took over once more, and I drifted back to sleep. The next time I awoke, the sky outside was still dark, but I had the sense that several hours had passed. This time, however, the sounds that roused me were very different. Heavy footfalls circled the tent, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths. My first thought was bear, and a jolt of fear shot through me. While wolves were unlikely to attack, a hungry or curious bear could easily see our tent as something to investigate more thoroughly. The unseen visitor seemed particularly interested in the spot where I had buried the fire pit. I silently cursed myself for not being more thorough in cleaning up. Even the faintest scent of food could attract a bear's keen nose. After nosing around the fire pit area, the bear turned its attention to our tent. Each lumbering step it took sent vibrations through the ground, emphasizing its massive size. As it circled closer, I knew I had to do something to deter it without provoking an attack. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I flicked it on, illuminating the tent from within. The sudden appearance of the glowing dome seemed to startle the bear. I heard a surprised huff, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Even after the sounds of the bear faded away, sleep eluded me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig brought me to full alert. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I finally felt it was safe enough to peer outside. Unzipping the tent cautiously, I stuck my head out and surveyed our surroundings. The meadow was peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of our nighttime visitors. A light rain had begun to fall, adding a misty quality to the scene that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Knowing we needed to leave quickly, I began packing up our campsite. The rain made everything damp, adding to the challenge of breaking camp. My dog seemed eager to be on the move, perhaps still unsettled by the night's events. We hiked back to the trailhead in record time, my pace quickened by the desire to return to the relative safety of populated areas. As we drove away from the parking lot, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering excitement from our wilderness encounter. Luck was finally on our side as we found a campground with a vacancy that morning. As I was setting up my damp tent to dry, a park ranger approached, clipboard in hand. He asked about my previous night's accommodation, mentioning they had a record of my entry but no registered campsite. In a moment of panic, I lied, claiming I had slept in my truck in a parking lot. The ranger seemed skeptical but didn't press the issue, simply reminding me of the park's camping regulations and moving on. I felt a twinge of guilt for the deception, but was relieved to avoid any potential fines or reprimands. The rest of our time in Yellowstone was, thankfully, far less eventful. We spent our days exploring the park's famous attractions, watching Old Faithful erupt, marveling at the colorful hot springs, and observing herds of bison from a safe distance. Each night I made sure we were safely checked into an official campsite well before dark. As our time in the park came to an end, we hit the road again, heading west towards Portland, Oregon. The journey took us through changing landscapes, from the rugged mountains of Idaho to the high desert of eastern Oregon, and finally into the lush greenery of the Pacific Northwest. We took our time, stopping at various campsites along the way. Each night, as I set up our tent in designated camping areas, I couldn't help but reflect on our Yellowstone adventure. While it had been frightening at times, it had also given me a profound respect for the wild places and creatures we share this planet with. Arriving in Portland felt like the end of an epic journey. The city's quirky charm and abundant green spaces were a welcoming sight after so many days on the road. We spent a week exploring the city and its surroundings, hiking in the Columbia River Gorge and along the Oregon coast. As I sat in a Portland coffee shop on our last day, planning the next leg of our journey, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of that night in Yellowstone. It had been unplanned, uncomfortable, and at times terrifying, but it was also an experience I would never forget. It had taught me about my own resilience, the unpredictability of nature, and the importance of respecting wildlife and wilderness areas. That night in Yellowstone, while not the comfortable camping experience I had initially planned, had become the defining moment of our cross-country adventure. It was a reminder that sometimes the most memorable experiences come from the unexpected turns in our journey, and that nature, in all its beauty and wildness, deserves our respect and admiration. As we prepared to leave Portland and continue our journey, I felt a renewed sense of excitement for the road ahead. Whatever challenges or adventures awaited us, I knew we were ready to face them. My loyal dog and I, two travelers making our way across this vast and beautiful country.